Chapter 1971. Shen Yuan Qingfeng's expression was indifferent as he interrupted Mr. White Lotus and sneered. You want to say that he likes me? I've known for a long time. I'll have to trouble Mr. White Lotus to pass a message to this guy hiding in Earth Lung Mountain. Tell him to come talk to me face to face if he has the ability. Then I'll let him know how the word regret is written. The young vassal king who had a grudge with the chief of Mount Longhu didn't hide his unperturbed expression at all. If there was a desk in front of him, he would probably slap the desk and shout, amazing. Bai Yu face-bombed and remained silent. After today's incident, Mr. White Lotus wouldn't dare to be frank with Zhao Ningxin in the letter even if he was beaten to death. Shen Yuan Qingfeng frowned and asked, You're just a little provincial governor. Is it really appropriate for you to stand side by side with a vassal king? Perhaps everything had its vanquishing factor. Bai Yu took a deep breath and turned to leave. He sighed deeply, probably lamenting that public morals were deteriorating day by day and that women were as fierce as tigers. Su Fengnian turned around and looked at the young girl who was sitting on the edge of the roof with her legs crossed. He winked at her and signaled with his eyes. Hee, the girl only chuckled. Compared to Su Fengnian's gloating over Zhao Ningxin's misfortune, she was clearly gloating even more. Su Fengnian knew that the narrow-minded little clay figurine had 3 thresholds that could not be said to be too high, not too high, not too low, and not too high either. In this lifetime, she would never be able to cross the threshold. One of the thresholds had something to do with the princess making things difficult for the princess. But previously, when Su Fengnian worked hard to help the princess earn so many copper coins on Mount Wudong, he had already slightly let go of this matter. The second threshold was related to a certain illusion of leaning against the wall. Chancellor Wang, who had leaked the heavenly secret, had already suffered. During that period of time when the young vassal king had nothing to do, he would play chess with the old man who couldn't control his mouth. He would beat the old man until he threw away his helmet and armor. He beat the old man so much that he almost vomited blood when he saw the chess set and box. The third threshold was related to moving books and sending books. All these years, the little clay figurine had always felt that the most difficult thing in the world was moving books like moving a mountain. However, a certain someone actually sent large boxes of secret manuals to the great snow plains of Mount Hui. Just now, Su Fengnian had already accepted his fate when Su Fengnian barged into the north-resisting city. Presumably, Jiang and I had already been alerted. It was already fortunate that he did not see the flying sword kill anyone. Su Fengnian's attempt to bribe Jia Jiajia was nothing more than a last-ditch struggle. Shen Yuan Qingfeng turned a blind eye to this and stood proudly at the top of the stone steps. Of course, she knew that there was a West Chu girl named Jiang Ni in this manner. She asked softly, How do you think one is doing now? Su Fengnian was stunned for a moment and was silent for a moment. I think about it occasionally, but I don't dare to think too much about it. She added, If there's a chance in the future, the 3 of us can get together? Back then, I didn't beat him up hard enough. It's a pity. Su Fengnian grinned. All right. But I'll say this first. When the time comes, I'll definitely stop you. She narrowed her eyes slightly and raised her chin slightly. She laughed softly. It doesn't matter if we win or lose. Regardless, that stingy one has to treat us to a drink and rip him off. Su Fengnian nodded. I definitely won't stop you. Shen Yuan Qingfeng looked around. I'll just find a place to stay. When I want to return to the Central Plains, you don't have to send me off. I reckon you won't be able to take care of me then. When I get back, I'll help you find that one guy first. No matter how big the Jianghu is, it's still mine. Su Fengnian said softly, Thanks. Shen Yuan Qingfeng dismissed it with a smile and disappeared. She came and went without a trace, like a swan goose stepping on snow. Her figure appeared below the northern wall of north-resisting city, and she walked slowly. May all the lovers in the world be together. She had said this to another girl before, and it was the most hateful sentence. However, she had never said it, and it was also the most hopeful sentence. Su Fengnian stood silently where he was. When he came back to his senses, he realized that everyone in the square was looking at him with different expressions. Even the sword grandmaster Chai Qingshan was whispering to the Wudong Zhenren Yu Xingrui, and his eyes were especially obscure and playful. Su Fengnian could do nothing about it, and he didn't want to explain further. It was tantamount to giving away 300 taels of silver here. When Su Fengnian arrived at the front yard of the second hall, he saw Deputy Provincial Governor Yang Shenxing standing beside a one-armed old man with white eyebrows, white hair, and white clothes. Su Fengnian glanced at the old man who looked more sage-like than a Taoist immortal hanging on a statue. He was also very distressed. Sui Shigu, last time at Mount Qingliang, I've already let you eat 3 famous swords in one go, including the Thunder of Thousand Gullies. Even if this north-resisting city is turned upside down, there won't be any swords to your liking. Take it that I'm begging you, don't make trouble. The ancestor of Eating Sword, whose long white eyebrows almost reached his knees, twitched the corner of his mouth and sneered. How could you not know that this old man has been coveting the 2 swords of Fuji and Shudao in Tide Listening Pavilion for a long time? This old man is heading north this time because he wants to make a deal with you. This old man will help you kill 2,000 Beimang barbarians outside the pass, at least 2,000 of them. In return, you will give the 2 swords of Fuji and Shudao to this old man. What do you think? Su Fengnian flatly refused. I've said it before. My second sister has been in love with those 2 swords since she was young. She couldn't even bear to take them out of Tide Listening Pavilion. That's why she brought the Red Stallion to Shangyin Academy to study. Even if I'm willing to exchange the 2 swords, do you think I dare? Sui Xiegu mocked. Indeed. Even if I lend Su Fengnian 100 times more courage, he wouldn't dare. Su Fengnian walked closer and said in a low voice, although the 2 swords of Fuji and Shudao are among the top 10 swords in the world, there are still 8 other swords in the Central Plains. I'll get you swords that are not inferior to these 2 swords. What do you think? Sui Xiegu sneered. It's hard to say if you'll live past the end of this autumn. Where do you get the confidence to help this old man get swords from the Central Plains to Beiliang? Su Fengnian naturally put his arm around Sui Shigu's shoulder and said, That's easy. If you can't get 2 swords of the same level as Shudao, I'll use 20 swords that are slightly inferior to them in exchange. Tide Listening Pavilion still has 7 or 8 swords left. If you ask the Fish Dragon Gang in Beiliang to work hard, I'll be able to get 20 swords. What do you think? As long as it involved business, the young king didn't put on airs and didn't care about his face. Sui Shigu shook his shoulder and shook off the young king's arm. Then he stretched out 2 fingers and twisted his snow-white eyebrows. He narrowed his eyes and pondered, weighing the pros and cons Su Fengnian struck while the iron was hot. He said, Senior Suetia, you see, there are so many grandmasters from the Central Plains in North Resisting City. Later on, there will be more grandmasters coming here. It shouldn't be hard for me to find a chance to ask them for some good swords. In short, I'll make sure you have a few dishes to go with your wine. What kind of friendship do we have? We fought side by side in the past and exchanged our lives with Cat Han Shengxian. We're like old friends. Don't you trust me, Su Fengnian? Sui Shigu stopped at the door of the study and turned to look at the young king. Trust you? Why don't you trust that old woman with the surname Tan Tai? Su Fengnian gave him a thumbs up. Senior Suetia, you're indeed a distinguished figure of the same generation as Lu Songtao of Zhulu Mountain. You have guts. Even I don't dare to call Tan Tai Pingjing, old woman. Deputy Provincial Governor Yang couldn't bear to look at them, let alone listen to them. He strode away. Chapter 1972. Sui Xiegu scolded in a low voice. This old man admits defeat. At such a young age. His skin is even thicker than my stomach that is filled with hundreds of famous swords. The young vassal accepted it calmly and smiled. Senior, you flatter me, you flatter me. After the 2 entered the study room, Sui Xiegu could not stand the young vassal's pretentious attentiveness. He decisively moved a chair and sat down. This was because he knew that the more attentive this bastard named Su was, the more likely he would suffer in the future. Sui Xiegu restrained his expression and asked, Is the left cavalry really gone? Su Fengnian sat behind the desk and nodded. Sui Xiegu frowned. Is the right cavalry going to join forces with the Great Snow Dragon Cavalry to block them, or are we going to let the Beimang army go straight to North Jebei City? Su Fengnian didn't beat around the bush, directly saying, Even if we don't stop them, we won't be able to stop them. Instead of wasting our main force in a meaningless battle, we might as well just let the northern Mang barbarians pile up corpses outside North Resisting City. As long as we can make it through this autumn and winter, when next spring arrives, especially when spring turns to summer, the northern Mang cavalry's days will become more and more difficult to endure. Sui Xiegu laughed. You actually want to reduce the pressure on Huaiyang Pass Fatty Chu, right? Su Fengnian did not answer immediately. A look of surprise flashed across his eyes. Jianghu had been around for 100 years, and its age was comparable to the later Sui, which was China's shortest age. The old man's long years of experience should not be underestimated. Sui Xiegu looked around at the simple study that did not have a single piece of furniture on top of the desk. He sighed slightly and said, "It's not easy to be a vassal king with real power like you." Su Fengnian laughed and waved his sleeves. One shoulder bright as the moon, 2 sleeves clean as the wind, and 4 bare walls. My name will definitely go down in history. Sui Xiegu mocked. To think that you can still laugh. Don't you think you've lost your father's face? Su Fengnian folded his hands in his sleeves and leaned back in his chair. He smiled faintly. No matter how useless my son is, no matter how disappointed Su Xiao is, he can't scold me to my face. Sui Xiegu's mouth twitched, but he did not comment. After a long time, he slowly said, I have lived for so many years, but my impression of the Beimang barbarians is not deep. However, compared to many of the people of the Central Plains who have only experienced the fires of war during the spring and autumn period, I have personally witnessed the cavalry of the grassland on a large scale. At the time, I was only 20 years old and happened to be traveling through Jizhou with a sword on my back. I was at a place where the north and south intersected. In the old Northern Han history books, it should be called the Great Pass. As for how the current Liang Imperial Court is named, I do not know. The old man's tone was gentle, without any heavy or intense emotions. I saw several thousand cavalry gallop into the pass. I, Sui Xiegu, am not a citizen of Northern Han. Moreover, I have never had much of an interest in my country. My ambition is to reach the peak of the path of the sword, not caring about worldly affairs. I have even less interest in the struggle for hegemony and the change of the country's surname. As a result, at that time, I did not hot-bloodedly charge into the pass with my sword alone. However, there is a small matter that you may not have seen. At that time, I saw jackals and wolves with full bellies on the side of the road, just like the fat rich men of peaceful times. When those beasts saw people, they actually didn't retreat and instead barked. At that time I did not feel much about it. I only felt that the weak were prey to the strong, and that it was only right and proper. On the contrary, it made me even more determined to pursue the path of martial arts. However, when I think back to that scene, I feel somewhat uncomfortable. This was actually the reason why the young vassal king did not have the extravagant hope that the Grand Masters of the Central Plains would remain in North Resisting City. Just as Sui Xiegu had said, thousands and tens of thousands of people had died tragically under the trampling of the steppes' iron hooves. Their heads and stomachs had been sliced open by war blades. Their corpses had been lifted into the air by spears, and their bodies had been pierced through by bows. No matter how many people died, in the eyes of the Jianghu experts who hoped to seize the championship of martial arts, the same scene in the eyes of the border soldiers and in the eyes of the grandmasters of Jianghu was like the difference between heaven and earth. Perhaps some people were not like the young swordsman Sui Xiegu. They would choose to stand up and take the initiative to intercept and kill the steppe cavalry. However, in the end, they would retreat in the face of difficulties. Although he had the 3-foot sword by his side, he chose to watch coldly from the side. Even though he had the 3-foot sword, he still hid his sword in its scabbard. Until now, he only felt uncomfortable. Su Fengnian could not do it. It was not necessarily because Su Fengnian was more benevolent than Sui Xiegu. It was only because he was born in the Su family and had followed the cripple's surname since childhood. Perhaps it was not at the border of Beiliang. If it was somewhere else, such as Jizhou or the two Liao provinces, if Su Fengnian was only a grandmaster of martial arts who did not participate in the invasion of Beimang from the south, he would also be the same as some of the grandmasters of Jianghu. He would only fight to his heart's content and then retreat in the face of difficulties. He would not have the unyielding determination to retreat. Chai Qingshan, Xue Songguan, Wei Miao, Mao Shulang, Cheng Baishuang, Ji Luan, and so on. These grandmasters of the Central Plains were already in North Resisting City, or were about to enter North Resisting City. Why would Su Fengnian want them to die outside the border of Liangzhou and resist the hundreds of thousands of Beimang's cavalry with their flesh and blood? Sui Xiegu, who was resting with his eyes closed, opened his eyes and broke the silence. He said in a low voice, Heaven can create all things and also kill all things. Su Fengnian, are you really not afraid? Su Fengnian smiled and asked, Did Tantai Pingjing say this? Sui Xiegu did not admit or deny it. Sui Xiegu stood up and walked to the window. His burly figure seemed lonely. The old man mocked himself. In terms of swordsmanship and sword will, I used to think that I would not lose to anyone. But strangely, I have never liked carrying a sword. Instead, I like to eat swords. Perhaps Li Chungang was right. I am not a swordsman. Then what am I? I've lived to this age, yet I'm still asking myself this question. What a joke. Before Sui Xiegu left the study room, Su Fengnian proposed a new deal. After a moment of shock, the ancestor of eating sword did not refuse or agree. He strode away. After the old man walked out of the study room, he walked slowly in the corridor. Suddenly, he turned his head and looked at the lush loquat tree in the courtyard. Not long after, the young king also left the study room. He handed a secret letter that he had just written to one of the leaders of the torture room. The two of them walked out of the room together. The young king said with a calm face, "After you hand the letter to him, tell him that if there is such a day, I, Su Fengnian, am begging him to do this." The old spy gritted his teeth and did not say a word. He just nodded vigorously. Then he quickly left the mansion and left North Resisting City. Su Fengnian stood on the steps and quietly looked into the distance. The autumn wind blew silently. Beimang's army was about to arrive at North Resisting City. Someone was preparing for his death. The young king turned around gently and looked up to see He and Su Ying sitting side by side on the roof. He made a face at them. Chapter 1973. Deep into the night, there was a porcelain oil lamp in the upper left corner of the study, imitating the style of the old Western shoe porcelain lamps. The lamp was hidden in the lip orifice and could be filled with water. The young man sat alone behind the table, reading a secret letter that he was already familiar with. He had been to the rich Gangnam-do, where the rich and noble families lived. Their houses were tall and bright, showing a peaceful and prosperous atmosphere. He had also been to the Great Peace City. Every festival, every street in the capital would have lotus lanterns. The lights stretched out and the candlelight was like an army marching in the night. It was the most spectacular sight. He had also seen the twinkling stars in the small town at night, and the lights were still dim. When he passed by small and big villages, it was a pleasant surprise to see an extremely small light. He put down the letter, got up, walked around the desk, came to the window, and gently pushed the window open. The letter was not an important military document, but a private secret letter that Li Yanchao had submitted to North Jebei City. However, it did not pass through the military office of North Jebei City, but was directly sent to the desk of the young king's study. The first deputy commander of the Right Cavalry used a heavy brush, the ink seeping through the back of the paper. Li Yanchao did not write any trivial words. He only wrote two simple sentences. Lu Deyuan should not have died. No one in Bailiang can treat the death of the left cavalry as the humiliation of the border army. In reality, Li Yanchao did not even need to write this letter. Su Fengnian was more familiar than Li Yanchao with how Lu Deyuan used troops and how he was as a person. How could a general that Su Xiao would mention so many times in the meeting hall of Mount Qingliang be a normal person? Su Xiao had left Liaodong with 800 old soldiers, 40 years of military service, and in the end, 300,000 Bailiang cavalry. There were many generals under his command. There were many who died on the battlefield, but there were also many who survived. Lu Deyuan was a full-fledged cavalry general. Almost everyone in the older generation of the Su family knew about him. From Yan Wenluan and Chen Yunchui to Zhou Kong and Yuan Nanting to Lu Jinu and Li Mofen, they all felt pity for Lu Deyuan who suddenly left the Bailiang frontier army. That regret was not inferior to the departure of Wu Qi and Su Pu. Before Lu Deyuan left the manor for the battlefield, Lu Deyuan privately visited Su Fengnian in the study and had a heart-to-heart conversation. After all, Lu Deyuan was not as relaxed and casual as he appeared to be when he assumed the role of commander-in-chief. On the contrary, Lu Deyuan, who had grown up with the Su clan's cavalry, was more familiar with tough battles than Li Yanchao and Ning Amei, who had risen to prominence outside the Liangzhou Pass, and was used to the saying, "The Northern Liang cavalry is the best in the world." It could even be said that the pain and suffering of those years had been carved into his bones. Therefore, Lu Deyuan had to make everything clear in front of the young lord. Lu Deyuan wanted to make Su Fengnian feel at ease, and also make himself feel at ease. In that face-to-face conversation, Lu Deyuan believed that the two cavalry forces of 60,000 would definitely not be able to safely roam in the increasingly narrow crevice outside the pass. Unless the left cavalry retreated to the north of Qingyuan Army Town, and the right cavalry went straight to the east of Grave Tomb Army Town, stretching out the battle line in the northeast and southwest. Only then would they have room to breathe. But in this way, although the 60,000 cavalry would drag out an ignoble existence, what would happen to the north? Although the left and right cavalry would still be able to pin down a certain number of Baimang cavalry, but to put it bluntly, the Baimang barbarians didn't even need to send out their main force. They just needed to casually throw 2 low-level cavalry forces to us, and when the time comes, we would have to lie on the back of our horses and watch the show. I, Lu Dayuan, am a big uncouth man. How to lead an army into battle, I learned bit by bit from the great general. I also consulted people like Su Pu, Wu Qi, and Yuan Zuozong, Chen Jibao. But I always felt that in the end, it was neither like a donkey nor like a horse, and it was not as convenient as my original method. In the end, I only believed in one principle. Once the cavalry entered the battlefield, they had to defeat the enemy's most elite field forces in one go. They absolutely could not lose the big picture for the sake of small gains and preserve their strength for the sake of the so-called overall situation. Otherwise, in a difficult battle with a great disparity in strength, the longer the battle dragged on, the more difficult it would be to fight. If it was a difficult battle, someone had to fight it. Otherwise, if everyone retreated again and again, all they could do was wait for death. How different would that be from that nest of old foxes and wolf cubs in the Bureau of Military Personnel of Liang? Su Fengnian stood by the window. The autumn air filled the room, and the lone lantern was cold. After opening the window, the chill was even heavier. Su Fengnian turned around. Back then, that man had been sitting on the chair in front of the desk. His appearance was ordinary. If he had not appeared in this study and instead stood on the fields within the pass, he would probably have been mistaken for a farmer with his face to the earth and his back to the sky. Your Highness, when I and the right cavalry set out at the same time, I will take the lead in breaking through to the north one day after the 2 armies have staggered, luring Murong Baoding's troops to gather their main forces. If nothing unexpected happens, Murong Baoding will definitely hear the news and request reinforcements from Wang Yong, the prefect of Aquarius Province. It's even very likely that he will temporarily transfer the Ruran cavalry to support Dong Lei's private cavalry. Your Highness, please be at ease. Even if my left cavalry is heavily surrounded, we will still kill at least 45,000 of the enemy's elite cavalry. Your Highness, I'll have to trouble you with one thing. When you go back, help me apologize to old Marshal He. Tens of thousands of border soldiers have been entrusted to me, but I can only take them to their deaths. My conscience can't be at ease, but I have no choice but to do this. Lu Dayuan is waiting for old Marshal He underground. However, it's best if I wait another 8 or 10 years. Haha, by then, old Marshal He probably won't have the strength to beat people up. With just a little bit of mercy, I'll be able to reincarnate. After this man stood up, he looked at the young vassal king who had also stood up and said in a low voice, "If in the future it is proven that I, Lu Dayuan, was wrong, then no one needs to bring wine to my grave. Presumably, I won't be able to drink that wine with a guilty conscience. Of course, that is if I still have a grave." The two of them walked to the door of the study together. Lu Dayuan suddenly asked, "Your Highness, do you think that in a few decades, there will still be people who remember us? Remember the battle that happened here?" Su Fengnian had shook his head and said, "Not necessarily." Damn it. Haha, Your Highness, please forgive me. I'm just a crude person. Nothing good comes out of a dog's mouth. It's fine. Su Xiao is the same. I've long gotten used to it. Everything was still vivid in his mind. Those words were still echoing in his ears for a long time. Su Fengnian pressed his hands on the window and leaned forward. Lu Dayuan, who had rushed to the battlefield with the heart of death, didn't leave any last words. If there were any, it would be too familiar. His Royal Highness had often heard it when he was young. It was just that he had changed his name. Su Fengnian slowly turned his head and looked at the door of the study. The man named Lu Dayuan had finally clasped his fist and said, "I am Lu Dayuan, the former cavalry general of Manjia Battalion, the current deputy commander of Left Cavalry. I request for a battle with you." Su Fengnian's lips moved slightly at that time. The 2 words were on the tip of his tongue, but in the end, he couldn't say it. Allow a battle. Su Fengnian's hand suddenly pressed down heavily. Under his 10 fingers, the bricks on the windowsill shattered. Su Fengnian took a deep breath. He waved his hand at the darkness outside the window, indicating that the men of sacrifice of the Fu Shui room didn't need to pay any attention. He walked back to the desk and pulled out a piece of paper from a yellowed military book. The contents of the paper were the words of a man who had participated in the construction of North Resisting City. He said to his wife and children who had already left Lingzhou. The letter said that after autumn, the weather wasn't too cold. The 1,000-layer cloth shoes sewn together were enough and didn't wear out too much. The clothes he brought to North Resisting City were also enough to keep him warm. He also met 2 fellow villagers from Lingzhou's Longqing County. When he was free, he would go to a small town outside the city to drink a few mouthfuls of wine. The price was cheaper than inside the pass. He heard that they had won the battle in Liuzhou. The walls of North Resisting City were very high. The Beimang barbarians definitely wouldn't be able to break through in a year and a half. He told her and her 2 sons to relax. In the future, as long as they still received the wages sent every month, it meant that the area outside the pass was very peaceful and that there was no war. In the end, the man told his wife not to worry about money and not to worry about it. The children's studies were the most important. The letter was sent to a certain place in the Central Plains, the man's ancestral home. This piece of paper was just a copy. The real letter had naturally been sent out a long time ago. After the man arrived outside the pass, he didn't know how to read, so he couldn't write a letter. He had to find a nameless and poor scholar in the marketplace to help him write it. Under the dim yellow light, Su Fengnian lowered his head to look at the thin piece of paper spread out on the desk. When the last letter was sent out, it happened to be right after Lu Deyuan left North Resisting City. The first day Lu Deyuan re-entered the border army, Bailiang's Fu Shui Bureau had already investigated this man's situation in Lingzhou's Longqing County town for more than 10 years. They sent the information one after another to the North Resisting City governor's residence, and then compiled it and placed it on the desk in this study room. Later on, Lu Deyuan's every move in North Resisting City or the left cavalry was recorded by the Fu Shui Bureau spies without any detail. Su Fengnian did not stop them. It was precisely by relying on these seemingly unreasonable and dark rules that Bailiang had reduced the number of casualties on the battlefield by a lot. However, on the matter of Lu Deyuan hiring someone to write a letter for him, Su Fengnian made a special trip to the torture chamber, and had the Fu Shui Bureau's chief in charge of related matters not to interfere. It was only on this letter that Su Fengnian went back on his word. He had the Fu Shui Bureau spies intercept the letter. Unfortunately, the old scholar who did the letter-writing business had already followed the troops and left the border. If they really wanted to find him, with the influence of the Fu Shui Bureau outside the pass, they would be able to find him. However, Su Fengnian thought about it and decided to drop the idea. He felt that since he had the letter in his hands, with his calligraphy skills and skill, it wouldn't be difficult to forge a letter every month. However, at this moment, Su Fengnian regretted it again. Because he discovered that it was as if he couldn't pick up the brush at all. Even if he picked up the brush again and again, he didn't know how to write the contents of the letter a month later. Su Fengnian stood up, walked out of the study room, and came to the courtyard. Chapter 1974. Still unable to calm down completely, Su Fengnian rose from the ground and swept to the horse path on the southern wall of Jebei City. He jumped lightly and sat cross-legged on the top of the wall. Soon, the sound of armor vibrating could be heard from far away on the horse path. When the armored soldiers realized that it was the young lord who had come to the top of the wall, they quickly retreated silently. Although they did not whisper to each other, they could see the passion in each other's eyes. Su Fengnian clenched his fists and propped them up on his legs. He sat in the north and faced the south, looking at the distant night sky. He sat there for a night. Before dawn, he quietly returned to the manor. Not long after he sat down in the study, a spy from the torture chamber came to report that Mao Shulang, Chang Baishuang, and Ji Luan, the 3 southern martial art masters, were about to arrive at the small town market in the south of the city that had suddenly become sparsely populated. Su Fengnian asked him to prepare a horse. After spending more than an hour dealing with the military and political affairs that had gradually piled up on his desk last night, he left the city alone. Su Fengnian did not specially come to welcome the 3 grandmasters of the Central Plains. He mainly wanted to take a look at the market and did not have too many reasons. Su Fengnian rode the horse to the small town. He dismounted and led the horse forward slowly. There were wine shops, tea houses, inns, and all kinds of scattered shops. Of course, one could not leave without legs. However, business was extremely poor. Some shops had simply closed down. This was reasonable. In just half a day, 3,000 to 4,000 people had left. Moreover, A large number of people who participated in the construction of the city had begun to return to their hometowns in batches under the escort of the local garrison. As Su Fengnian walked, there were shop assistants squatting under the eaves with sleepy eyes and yawning. The sudden drop in business made them happy to take a break from work. There were merchants who shouted loudly for their servants to move their goods to the south. They looked worried. There were brothel girls who leaned on the railings and looked up at the big red lanterns when they had nothing to do. It was rare for them to wake up so early. There were strong escorts who were escorting rare items from Lingzhou. They only cared about the safety of the goods and did not care about the shopkeeper's frown. At the end of the street, Su Fengnian suddenly saw an old Taoist priest pushing a cart towards the south. He was as thin as a match and his arm strength was weak. There was a linen poster on his cart that was used to solicit business. From top to bottom, there were 2 lines of regular script: Ziwei Do Shu, 8 trigram 6 lines, not bad, and face and palm reading, Chimen Duanjia, not bad. Su Fengnian smiled knowingly. This fortune teller was really honest. He led the horse forward quickly and bent down to help push the cart. The old man's Taoist robe that had been washed until it was white was out of place. In any case, Su Fengnian had never seen it before during his travels to Liang and Beimang. This was not strange. Taoist temples that could obtain credentials from the government all had very particular designs for their Taoist robes. If they were to forge and sell them without permission, once the county government found out, the crime would not be small. Back then, Su Fengnian had rented a Taoist robe when he first traveled the Jianghu. It was also a robe of questionable origin that could not be found. Even if the government had their eyes on it and wanted to get to the bottom of it, it would be difficult for them to convict him. The person in front of him was clearly someone similar to His Royal Highness, who was in dire straits back then. The fortune teller, who could barely be called a Taoist priest, narrowed his eyes and said, "Young master, you must be from a wealthy family. If I'm not wrong, your father's generation outside the Great Wall is very powerful." Su Fengnian's words hit the nail on the head. He smiled and said, "You saw that my horse was able to follow its master by itself after the reins were loosened. There's no doubt that it's a Bailiang war horse. In addition, the war is imminent and I dare to take a horse for a stroll here, so you deduce that I'm a descendant of a general, right?" The fortune teller's smile was forced. The immortal demeanor that he had painstakingly squeezed out disappeared and he was beaten back to his original state. Su Fengnian sighed and said, "To be honest, in my early years, I was similar to you. In order to make a living, I pretended to be a god and became a fortune teller. You're a little better than me at that time. In any case, you have a tricycle." Su Fengnian joked, "But to be honest, you're really like a crane in a flock of chickens with your banner. How can you have any business?" The old man laughed and said, "Actually, it doesn't matter. Earning money here mainly depends on writing letters for people or peddling small safety talismans folded from yellow paper. 3 copper coins for one, so my business is passable. Before those Bailiang foreigners left, it was enough for me to eat meat and drink wine twice a day. Commoners like me are just ordinary people. When we pray to Buddha, God and Bodhisattva, we must first ask for peace and stability. Then we ask for marriage and the right time. Finally, we ask for scholarly achievements and riches. Young master, don't you think so?" Su Fengnian nodded and said softly, "The commoners are actually using 3 copper coins to get peace of mind. You're doing a good thing." As if recalling those happy times of drinking wine and eating meat, the elder's face beamed with joy. However, soon after, he couldn't help but angrily say, "If our prince was a bit more formidable, this little old man's business would still be good for a month or so. Who would have thought that the northern Mang barbarians would attack north-rejecting city so early? What a waste of my life to obtain this trade. I've suffered a great loss. Now that I've returned to the pass, the days will be hard to bear." Su Fengnian laughed and said, "That vassal king really deserves to be scolded. What great grandmaster of wushu commentary. It's useless." Perhaps he realized that the young master beside him was a son of a general and was closely related to the rise and fall of the Bailiang Su family. In Jianghu, it was reasonable to say too much and it was taboo to talk too much. Therefore, the old man quickly changed his tone and mediated, "You can't say that. It's not easy for our prince to support such a large family property. His luck is not good either. Soon the Beimang barbarians will invade and they won't even give us a chance to fart. It's still not easy for our prince and the border army." The old man seemed to be unable to make up any more lies. He became more embarrassed and seemed to be restrained. His strength to push the cart became weaker. Chapter 1975. Su Fengnian increased the force of his hand and smiled. Sir, you're lying. Don't worry, even though I'm a general of Bailiang, I can still listen to the words of others. I don't care if they're good or bad. Of course, I'll be happier if I hear good things. The old man and Su Fengnian pushed the cart south and were about to cross the river. The old man looked back at the towering city walls and suddenly stomped his feet. There are some things that I can't hold back. Even if you bring me to Bailiang City to condemn me, I'll still spit it out. Su Fengnian smiled bitterly. All right, I'm sure it won't be anything good. Sir, please speak. I'll pretend I didn't hear anything. The old man laughed and straightened his back. He turned north and pointed at Bailiang City. Sir, I've heard a lot of rumors recently. They're all saying that our prince is too daring. He didn't use so many old generals but chose to use those kids who haven't even grown hair yet. How can we fight this battle? Who won the first battle of Liangmang? Wasn't it General Lu Jinu of Liangzhou's Huta City? Wasn't it General Wang Lingbao of Liuzhou's Longxiang army? Wasn't it because of Yozhou's Crouching Bao and Crane Luan Glow? Wasn't it because of the dead officers of the three cities? Wasn't it because of our Bailiang's most outstanding Great Snow Dragon cavalry? And the two heavy cavalry armies that we've trained for many years? How many young foreigners are there? Only Melancholy Blade can barely be considered one. In my opinion, don't look at how Liuzhou has won a few battles. When it comes to critical moments, young people can't be relied on. The old man turned to look at the side of the young man's face and asked, Sir, what do you think? Su Fengnian looked into the distance. Sir's words make some sense. However, the world is strange. Some things that make sense aren't necessarily true. The old man's eyes widened. Sir, are you a scholar or a general's son? Why can't I understand what you're saying? Su Fengnian sighed. I don't deserve to be called a scholar. It shouldn't be wrong to say that I'm a general's son. I grew up drinking sand, smelling horse dung, and listening to drums. After boldly expressing his thoughts, the old man's mood relaxed. He rarely joked. Sir, other than being unreasonable, you're quite easy to talk to. Su Fengnian said helplessly, Old mister, is this a compliment or an insult? The old man laughed and said, Young master, you just have to listen to nice things. You'll never go wrong. Su Fengnian's mood also lightened up, and the haze between his brows gradually faded away. He smiled knowingly and said, I've learned something. The old man didn't ask Su Fengnian to help push the carriage across the bridge. He pushed the carriage south alone. He lowered his voice and muttered to himself, If only the great general was still alive. How would the Baimang barbarians dare come to our side? Bailiang doesn't even know how to fight. So what if we've won the battle? So many people will still die. I heard that there are 300,000 stone tablets behind Mount Qingliang. They're all empty toys. Being able to live is at least better than leaving behind a name after death, right? Su Fengnian stood still and didn't say anything. The old man certainly couldn't guess the young man's identity. He didn't think that a martial arts master would help him push the carriage, so he continued to complain. In my opinion, since the Central Plains Imperial Court is not a good thing, it's better to directly open the gate and let the Baimang barbarians enter the Bailiang Pass instead of letting our Bailiang frontier army soldiers die outside the pass. As long as both sides don't bump into each other inside and outside the Bailiang Pass, everything will be fine. Let those ungrateful people in the Central Plains suffer. Our people in Bailiang can live a peaceful life. I don't want to see the young king, or I'll definitely persuade him not to be impulsive and listen to the old man's advice. Don't blindly try to be a hero. Su Fengnian narrowed his eyes and raised his head. The autumn wind messed up the young man's hair. Maybe it was because he was miserable, or maybe it was because he felt guilty, or maybe it was both, so the young king didn't speak from beginning to end. On the south side of the bridge, the back of the old man pushing the carriage was getting farther and farther away. Su Fengnian seemed to remember something and shouted, Old man, don't be in a hurry to go south. And don't forget that within 20 days, the people can use the 3 post-house roads from Beijing City to Liangzhou Pass. There's no need to take a long detour. The old fortune-teller seemed to have heard the shout. He paused for a moment, indicating to the young man that he understood, and then continued to go south. After the mansion was built, The study room received confidential intelligence reports from inside and outside the pass every day. There were reports from the Fu Shui room and the Ying room. Baelyong's intelligence reports were always divided into 3 levels according to priority. Originally, the intelligence reports that were qualified to be sent to the study room were only the A-level intelligence reports. But the young king asked for an extra level of intelligence reports. In fact, it was not important for military affairs, but the new king used it to ease the tension. Although the 2 branches must have done a certain degree of screening, and it was impossible to really send all the intelligence reports to the study room, the number was still relatively large, and most of them were related to the situation of the academy or the scholars' opinions. The content was varied, and there was no lack of some extreme comments from young scholars. The young king always just browsed and didn't comment. There was a comment that the young king personally wrote down and used it as a daily self-reflection. Little virtue but high status, little wisdom but great schemes, little strength but heavy responsibilities. With such a muddle-headed king in charge of the border, the Baelyong frontier army will undoubtedly be defeated. The army's pressure, the father's last wish, the bitter cold hometown, the imperial court's constraint, the beautiful central plains, innocent people, and the heavenly law's pressure. They were all heavy responsibilities, layered on top of each other. On the north side of the bridge, the young man, who was less than 4 years old, slowly squatted down by the river. After dusting a licorice, he put it in his mouth and gently chewed. His mouth was full of sweetness. Chapter 1976. Su Fengnian suddenly stood up and whistled softly. The warhorse drinking water by the riverside galloped over. After mounting the horse, Su Fengnian grabbed the reins with one hand and clenched his other hand into a fist. He knocked heavily on his shoulder and grinned. Far away in the south, the old man did not stop walking. Tears flowed down his face as he muttered softly. "How do you feel now?" The old man finally stopped and looked around. All he could see was the yellow sand of the desert. Tide Listening Pavilion's strategist Li Yishan did not have a burial place after his death. His ashes were scattered outside the pass. The old man smiled and said, "Yishan, in life and in death, I was not as good as you." At the southern gate of Beiqing City, Su Fengnian suddenly stopped his horse and turned his head. The slight abnormality that he sensed with his celestial being body was fleeting. In an instant, calmness was restored and no trace could be found. Like an autumn leaf falling into a pond, there were few ripples. It was quiet and serene. Previously, in that unknown corridor in Liuzhou, the Liuzhou infantry faced off against the 50,000 southern cavalry of Beimang. Liangzhou's General Shi Fu was indeed as stated in the military document he submitted to the king of Fongbei City. He did not lead the 6,000 Qingyuan army elite cavalry to rush to the aid of the corridor battlefield. Instead, he stood firm on the plains south of the corridor, patiently waiting for Huang Songpu's main force to withdraw to the north. At the same time, he needed to prevent the southern dynasty's border cavalry reinforcements from going south to join up with Huang Songpu's remaining troops. This Liangzhou general only symbolically sent a scout to the corridor to investigate the military situation. Shi Fu stopped his horse and looked south. His back was always to the bloody battlefield that was destined to be filled with corpses. His face was calm and his heart was stone. On the southernmost Old Woman Mountain main battlefield, Liang Mang's side suffered the heaviest casualties in the third charge. Ko Jianghuai threw in the cavalry that belonged to the Liuzhou provincial governor manor. Huang Songpu also used 600 true heavy cavalry. The men and horses were all equipped with armor. Every particularly tall and strong Beimang warhorse was equipped with face, neck, chest, body armor, and parasitic armor. They were collectively known as iron cavalry armor that spears and arrows could not penetrate. Qi Fu Longguan, the young general who temporarily took control of the Lu province cavalry from Ko Jianghuai, once again led the remaining direct collision camp cavalry to charge at the 600 heavy cavalry. Only, while Qi Fu Longguan led the charge, Su Longxiang personally led the 300 Dragon Elephant elite cavalry, gradually catching up to the direct collision camp on the battlefield. In the end, they were neck to neck with the direct collision camp, opening up the formation together. After the 3 charges, the Liuzhou cavalry was almost completely wiped out. The Longxiang army also suffered great losses. On the other hand, even though Huang Songpu's elite cavalry suffered great losses, the most numerous E-type cavalry still miraculously maintained a high level of integrity. There were 30,000 cavalry. According to the situation of the Old Woman Mountain battlefield, even without the 50,000 reinforcements, Commander Huang Songpu had full confidence in wiping out the Liuzhou main force. However, right at this time, a majestic cavalry army entered their field of vision from the plains east of Old Woman Mountain. That scene was like the sun rising over the eastern sea. This elite cavalry army that came to reinforce Old Woman Mountain without any warning spread out in a line. Like a wave of Guangling River, they rapidly advanced from east to west. This cavalry army that appeared out of nowhere was definitely the easiest to recognize apart from the Great Snow Dragon Cavalry in the Bailiang Frontier Army. This was because each of their helmets had a snow-white eagle feather that fluttered in the wind. On the sides of each horse's saddle, there were arrows that shot out like two lumps of reed flowers. The cavalry's advance was like a great snowstorm surging between heaven and earth. Not only was the armor dyed in blood, the two spears that had already been replaced, the Baimang commander Huang Songpu's face was covered in blood. He turned his head to the east, his eye sockets about to split apart. On the Old Woman Mountain battlefield, after both sides spared no effort in the three vicious attacks, their Baimang cavalry army just happened to be at the original Liuzhou cavalry position. This was originally the plan of this Baimang Southern Dynasty's #1 person. He wanted to wait until Liuzhou's main force suffered great losses, their energy falling to rock bottom. As long as the Baimang cavalry army was in the southern battlefield, they would be able to form a natural line of defense that could prevent the Liuzhou cavalry from turning back to the south. However, reality proved that the old commander's plan succeeded. However, Ko Zhonghuai's plan also succeeded. That young Liuzhou main general didn't plan on withdrawing from Old Woman Mountain at all. He clearly wanted to turn around and surround the Baimang army. Huang Songpu didn't hesitate in the slightest. He ordered the entire army to do their best to break through the encirclement. Even if they were ambushed along the way, they were not to be entangled in battle. They just had to head north and meet up with the reinforcements that were about to arrive at the northern battlefield of Old Woman Mountain. Victory would still be on the side of Baimang. Qi Fu Longguan, Su Longxiang and Liemo Fan, these three generals who had fought side by side at Old Woman Mountain, didn't even need to greet each other before they quickly changed their formation. From the left, middle, and right armies Yanqi formation to a horizontal snake formation, stretching out as far as possible to form a long front line. Every dog has its day. It was now the turn of the Liuzhou border armies front, middle, and back to charge. Liemo Fan's Dragon Elephant Cavalry was in the front 2 rows, Su Longxiang's army was in the middle, and Qi Fu Longguan's remaining Liuzhou cavalry was at the back. What they needed to do was no longer to kill the enemy. They only needed to try their best to stop the horse hooves of Huang Songpu's main force from breaking through the encirclement. After Yuan Nanting's White Feather Light Cavalry unleashed 3 waves of arrows from the flanks of Northern Mang's main army, another 6,000 cavalry with an imposing aura found an opportunity to draw their blades in an orderly fashion and charge into the enemy formation. It was as if they had sliced through the waist of Baimang's cavalry formation. Huang Songpu's direct cavalry, Wanyan's private cavalry, and the 30,000 second cavalry were all sliced in half. The rest of the main force, the White Feather Light Cavalry, began to circle northward, not engaging in a chaotic battle with the Northern Mang army. Instead, they relied on the advantage of light cavalry, which was originally charging from east to west, to quickly circle northward. If someone had just climbed to the top of Old Woman Mountain and looked down at the battlefield, they would probably think that this light cavalry was an ally of the Grassland Cavalry, and that they were heading north together from the left and right. Baimang's Kiliarchs and Centurions led their remaining forces to charge fearlessly at the right flank of the White Feather Light Cavalry in despair. Unfortunately, that heroic scene ended up like a stone hitting a river. It couldn't disrupt the pace of the White Feather Light Cavalry at all. The White Feather Light Cavalry, after suffering from the Northern Mang Cavalry's diagonal charge, easily moved slightly closer to the right. The leftmost formation that was originally more or less straightforward now had depressions everywhere, as if there were pockets that the Northern Mang death-sworn soldiers smashed into. What awaited these grassland barbarians was definitely not the Northern Cold Blade that engaged in close combat, but rather the extremely skilled cavalry archery. The 200 to 300 Southern Court cavalry were shot down like rice paddies, without the slightest bit of bitterness from the collisions, not dying miserably on horseback. When faced with the White Feather Light Cavalry's arrows, the Northern Mang cavalry, who were able to continue charging a dozen or so steps forward before falling off their horses, they only felt a type of remaining grievance and helplessness. When faced with the White Feather Light Cavalry's arrows, the Northern Mang cavalry, who were able to continue charging more than 10 steps forward before falling off their horses, only felt a type of remaining grievance and helplessness. In the northernmost part of the Crone Mountain battlefield, only dust could be vaguely seen. It was the 4,000 iron stupas under Ning Amei's command that were inserted between the two battlefields. At the peak of the Crone Mountain, Ko Jianghua said calmly, "The situation is set. Huang Songpu is finished." Chen Shiliang also saw the situation on the battlefield. A smile appeared on his pale face. He turned his head and said with a hoarse voice, "General Ko is worthy of the title God of War." Ko Jianghua looked to the east. "I'm afraid of losing the big picture for the small." Chen Shiliang asked doubtfully, "After the battle at the Crone Mountain, what's wrong with sending troops east to reinforce North Resisting City?" Ko Jianghua shook his head. "Who said we're going to North Resisting City?" Chen Shiliang was dumbfounded. At the foot of the Crone Mountain, Li Hanlin gathered the crossbowmen and prepared to enter the battlefield again. The secret retainer that was sent by the young king to protect the White Horse Commandant, Lu Huang of the Martial Emperor City, was about to get on his horse and follow them. Li Hanlin said with a firm expression, "Lu Huang, you go directly to North Resisting City." A dignified martial Dao great grandmaster eating sand behind my butt. So boring. Lu Huang didn't seem to be surprised at all. He sat on the horse and looked at the mostly young faces. Finally, he smiled and nodded at Li Hanlin. He joked, "Boy, don't be greedy and die. Otherwise, your king of Bailiang won't forgive me." Li Hanlin grinned. "Help me tell Brother Nian that we made a promise when we were young to pee in the temple of West Baimang. His share, I'll take care of it." Lu Huang rolled his eyes and reminded, "Then remember to drink more water before doing it." Li Hanlin laughed. "I'll even drink horse pee." Lu Huang gave a thumbs up before he rode away. "I'm convinced." In the Battle of the Corridor, 6 battles and 6 defeats. The 50,000 people of Baimang's southern border town cavalry were completely driven into madness. After 6 charges, there were only 20,000 people left. Even if they knew that they were unable to help the Old Woman Mountain battlefield, even if they were destined to be severely punished by the Emperor, these red-eyed grassland cavalry still launched the 7th attack without hesitation. As long as Chao Wei led his 9,000 elite cavalrymen into the battlefield from the north entrance of the corridor, even if it was only 30 minutes later, the monk soldiers of Mount Lantua and the 3,000 soldiers of Liuzhou would be completely wiped out. When Chao Wei personally led 800 men of sacrifice to break through Baimang's formation and killed all the way to the circular formation formed by only 200 people, there were only corpses. Along the way, they saw shattered iron shields, broken lances, broken Modeo swords, and destroyed bows and crossbows scattered all over the place. The so-called simple circular formation was just the monk soldiers of Lantua Mountain and the young men of Liuzhou who were all heavily injured. They were just waiting for death. The one who really blocked the charge of Baimang's barbarian cavalry was a slender man in armor and covered in blood. He was the eldest disciple of Wang Xianji of Martial Emperor City, the Grand Master of the Central Plains, Yu Groom. This person held a modeo that cut horses and a cold saber hung on his left and right waist. The number of Baimang cavalry that died under his saber was no less than 900. Yu Groom had personally promised the young king that he would ensure that Xie Shibian didn't die. Chapter 1977. It was not that he could not forcefully take Xie Shibian out of the corridor and out of this blood-soaked battlefield. But when Xie Shibian personally fought a bloody battle and defeated the Baimang cavalry for the 5th time, he firmly shook his head at Yu Groom. Yu Groom laughed it off and did not force him. Instead, he picked up a long spear and a mo sword from the battlefield. The two fought side by side. This continued all the way until Western Xie suffered serious injuries. At that time, this Lu province deputy general who couldn't get up was grabbed by a middle-aged monk who was in charge of Western Xie's safety by the shoulder from under the hooves of a northern Mang cavalry, and then heavily flung backwards. The monk who was already an arrow at the end of its flight was instead swarmed by several dozen riders, dying on the spot. Chao Wei's cavalry quickly slaughtered their way out from behind, becoming the final straw that broke the camel's back. After the northern Mang side cavalry barely managed to stop Chao Wei's vanguard cavalry charge, they were quickly completely routed. These cavalry of the southern dynasty did not dare to fight or die. Otherwise, they would not have charged to their death 7 times. But Chao Wei's cavalry appeared out of the blue. It was too sudden and too fierce. Especially in the narrow corridor, 9,000 cavalry launched an endless charge. It was as if there was only the endless figures of the Baimang cavalry in their field of vision. The northern Mang cavalry suffered a crushing defeat. After a major commander led 700 riders under his command towards the bridegroom's ruined circular formation that was clearly already on the verge of collapse, but still wasn't willing to fall, all of the Southern Court's border cavalry made their way around that unfamiliar Marshal Dao Grand Master, who could hold back 10,000 men by himself, quickly making their way around that circular formation, decisively fleeing south from both sides. Chao Wei jumped off the back of his horse and almost fell. He stumbled into the round formation and finally saw the young general sitting cross-legged with a blade. His helmet was long gone and his armor was broken. Blood blurred his originally elegant face. A one-armed young man from Liuzhou had to use his elbow to lightly press against the back of this general. Chao Wei knelt on one knee and reached out his trembling hand to gently wipe away the blood on the young general's face. In fact, the young general had already lost consciousness. He was just holding on to his last breath, unwilling to collapse. Yu Groom ruthlessly threw out his Modeo, splitting a Beimang cavalry generals, 2 people, and their horses into 2 halves. He came to Chao Wei and Xie Shibian's side, squatted down behind them, and reached out to hold Xie Shibian's wrist. Let's not talk about the external injuries, but the internal organs have been injured. Only if you are lucky enough will you have a chance to survive. Without saying a word, Chao Wei turned around and punched the bridegroom's chest. His eyes were red as he scolded angrily. Su Fengnian asked you to stay by Xie Shibian's side just for this bullshit slim chance of survival? Bridegroom, you didn't say anything. He just continued to lower his head and inject a gentle aura into Xie Shibian. Xie Shibian was not willing to leave. Yu Groom, who had never been on the battlefield, did not know why, but he also felt that he should not leave. The 2 of them did not leave. Xie Shibian felt that he should die in battle here. Yu Groom felt that dying in the yellow sand outside Liuzhou Pass was not too bad. However, after saving the deputy general of Liuzhou many times, the latter angrily said, "Yu Groom, you. Every time you save me you kill 3 or 4 fewer people. Do you want me to teach you how to calculate this?" After punching Yu Groom, Chao Wei did not immediately pull back his arm. Instead, he loosened his fist and heavily patted this Grand Master of the Central Plains on the shoulder. He choked out, "Thank you." Yu Groom still did not raise his head. He only asked, "After Xie Shibian's injuries have stabilized, can I entrust him to you and send him to Qingcang in Liuzhou? I want to go to North Rejecting City." Chao Wei nodded and did not say anything. After a long time, Yu Groom loosened his fingers and slowly stood up. He pressed both hands on the cold sabers at his waist and asked again, "Temporarily lend me 2 sabers. Does this count as violating Beiliang's military law?" Chao Wei took a deep breath and shook his head with a smile. "From now on, Yu Groom, you are a cavalry commandant under Great General Chao's command. How about it? The battle in the corridor was won by you through your own merits. Not to mention 2 cold sabers, you can hang them all over your body." Yu Groom laughed it off. Joining the Beiliang Frontier Army and becoming a cavalry general under Chao Wei was absolutely impossible for the first disciple of Wang Xianji who was focused on martial arts. However, Yu Groom could not refuse this kindness. He lowered his head and stared at Xie Shibian who he had pulled back from the gates of hell. Then, he walked a few steps away and tiptoed. His body instantly rose from the ground. He went straight to North Rejecting City. On the day when the young lord of North Rejecting City and the 3 martial grandmasters of Nanjiang entered the city one after another, the great victory at Old Woman Mountain in Liuzhou was quickly reported to North Rejecting City. The city was bustling with noise. However, almost 2 hours later, another urgent spy report came to the mansion. The 400,000 cavalrymen of Beimang would arrive at North Rejecting City in 3 days at the latest. After Mao Shulang entered the North Rejection City, he requested to climb up the city wall. After getting permission from the mansion, the burly old man began to walk alone along the horse path. He walked and stopped, not saying a word. The old scholar in green, Chang Baishuang, quickly broke through the realm on small lotus peak of Wudong Mountain and directly entered the great celestial state. After accompanying his good friend Ji Lu and into the mansion, he stayed in the ceremonial room and learned from the famous literary guru, Chancellor Wang. Only Ji Lu An, the chief guest of the Dragon Palace of Nanjiang, came to the study of the second hall to visit the famous young lord of the Central Plains. Su Fengnian did not deliberately go down the stairs to greet him. He just stood at the door of the study with a smile on his face. After leading Ji Lu An into the study, he personally handed him a cup of Beiliang Frontier Army's tribute tea. Ji Luan took the tea and sat down. He went straight to the point and said, "Your Highness, if I am willing to go out of the city to fight, is there a place for me?" Su Fengnian also asked directly, "Is it just a formality to fish for fame in the Central Plains? Or do you really want to go all out and fight to the end?" Ji Luan gently twisted the tea lid and rubbed the edge of the cup. He raised his head and asked, "What's the difference?" Su Fengnian smiled and said, "If it's the former, it's simple. You don't even need to enter the battlefield. I will let Fu Shui and Yongying Branch release the news to encourage you." Ji Luan smiled. "What if I choose the latter?" Su Fengnian said indifferently, "Then I'm afraid Mr. Ji will have to say his last words to the two old friends of Nanjiang first. Because Beimang's 400,000 troops will come to North Rejecting City in 3 days. You won't have the chance to follow Bailiang's cavalry to fight outside the pass. You will only have an extremely difficult battle to fight. To tell you the truth, even I don't have the confidence to say that I can defend North Resisting City." Ji Luan, who was sitting on the chair opposite the desk, was silent. He hadn't even taken a sip of the tea in his hand. Ji Luan finished the tea in his cup in one gulp and gently placed it on the desk. He then placed his sword on his knees and smiled calmly. "If I didn't come to Bailiang with Cheng Baishuang, I wouldn't care about the outcome of Liangmang's war. But since I'm here, I might as well take this opportunity to vent my anger." Su Fengnian said softly, "Decades of hard work in martial arts. It's not easy to have the cultivation of a grandmaster." Ji Luan suddenly laughed angrily. "Speaking of martial arts, Your Highness, are you saying that I, Ji Luan, have spent decades of my life as a dog?" Su Fengnian was stunned for a moment. He quickly waved his hand and said with a smile, "Mr. Ji, don't say it out loud." Ji Luan glared at him. At this moment, Ji Luan quickly turned his head and was shocked to see a young girl hanging upside down outside the window. She pointed to Su Fengnian's direction. Su Fengnian said softly, "I know, don't worry." Not long after, the peach blossom sword god, Dong Tai, who had 2 swords hanging from his waist, slowly walked into the study. Ji Luan stood up and nodded to Dong Tai to greet him. There had always been many talented swordsmen in the world of swordsmen. But after the death of the previous generation's sword god, Li Chungang, there was only one person in front of him who was worthy of being called the most talented swordsman. Since Ji Luan was a swordsman, no matter if he was conceited or arrogant, no matter how high his status was in Jianghu, he should respect this ordinary-looking middle-aged swordsman. After Dong Tai calmly returned the greeting, he directly turned his head to look at the young king and asked, "I won't drink the tea. Just tell me, when will the war with Beimang start? Where do you need me to be?" Su Fengnian said, "I may need to trouble you to fight twice. The first time will be quick, in a few days. The second time, it may only be the 2 of us, and the battlefield will be further away." Dong Tai said calmly, "The 2 swords I brought are enough." After saying this, Dong Tai turned and left. Ji Luan also said goodbye to Su Fengnian and followed the Peach Blossom Sword God's footsteps to ask him some questions about swordplay. There were different levels of knowledge and specialization in different fields. Dong Tai could be said to be the top swordsman in the world, whether it was swordplay or swordsmanship. Most importantly, although Ji Luan was only at the mysterious finger realm, he had never shown his trump card, the 3 swords. He believed that his power could kill a celestial state master. Dong Tai had always been recognized as the world's #1 mysterious finger realm master. He was even better than Catman Han Shengxian. How could Ji Luan not be tempted to ask for some advice? On the same day, the Snow House Spear Saint Li Hongho and many other top Jianghu bosses entered North Reject City. Su Fengnian did not show up. Even the polite greetings were skipped. It was only when a blind female Guqin player entered the city that Su Fengnian personally went to the gate of the mansion. The 2 who had faced each other in life and death in the past walked together to the meeting hall. Su Fengnian asked curiously, "Miss Shui, do you have a message for Su Su or this old man Lu?" The blind lady with the Guqin bag shook her head and said, "Su Su's guilt towards Bailiang, I will repay it." Su Fengnian stopped in his tracks. "Have you ever thought that if you die outside Liangzhou Pass, who will repay Su Su's regret for the rest of her life?" Shui Songguan's tone was as cold as usual. "I only know that Su Su is not happy. I did not do what I could. I will not be happy in this life." Su Fengnian shook his head and said in a low voice, "Shui Songguan, I advise you to return to Western Shu and return to Su Su's side." Chapter 1978. Xue Songguan also shook her head. I can't let him continue to think that Su Su is useless. Su Fengnian blurted out. Have you ever thought about what Su Su wants and what she wants the most? Xue Songguan turned her head. She, who was blind, gently looked at the young king. Su Fengnian was suddenly speechless. What was the difference between the things he had done and this seemingly unreasonable and stubborn woman? Su Fengnian let out a heavy breath and bitterly smiled. Then stay. Xue Songguan nodded. The two continued to move forward. Su Fengnian suddenly said, At this moment, Shortcake must be jealous. Xue Songguan smiled knowingly. Her face was full of gentleness. Su Fengnian snorted, Miss Xue, you actually fell for a guy like Shortcake, really? The young king did not continue. Xue Songguan smiled. Your Highness wants to say that you are blind, but I am a blind person. Su Fengnian was a bit embarrassed. Su Fengnian stopped as if he was struck by lightning. His body stiffened. Xue Songguan frowned. She did not turn around, but she already felt 3 powerful auras behind her. One of them was so majestic that it was suffocating. A young man and a young woman. Both of them had shocking bloodstains on their bodies. A middle-aged man holding an iron spear walked towards Su Fengnian and Xue Songguan. Su Fengnian slowly turned around and looked at the 3 people who were supposed to be at Huayang Pass. Su Yanbing, the current sword crown of the Wu family sword tomb, Wu Lu Ding, and sword attendant Cui Hua. Su Yanbing smiled. Don't worry, the outer city of Huayang Pass is still there. Su Fengnian was relieved, but his face was still dignified. Su Yanbing explained, It was Chu Lushan who wanted the 3 of us to go back to North Resisting City. He said that 80 Wu swordsmen would be enough. The 3 of us can only stare at each other all day long. It's meaningless. It's better to go back to North Resisting City. Su Fengnian was about to speak, but Wu Lu Ding already impatiently said, You know what kind of character Fatty Chu is. If he is determined to drive us away, I'm afraid that we won't be able to eat in Huayang Pass. Actually, what Chu Lushan said is not wrong. 80 sword mounds cavalry should be enough to deliver intelligence at the moment. Su Yanbing glared at the young sword mound, who spoke without thinking, and the latter shut his mouth resentfully. Su Yanbing said in a low voice, Chu Lushan said that Bailiang will definitely win at Crone Mountain. Next, the Liuzhou border army will go all the way north to Xijing. Beimang's army will have to speed up their attack on North Resisting City. It's a gamble to see who can break through their nest faster. Chu Lushan also said that as long as North Resisting City can hold on until the winter snow melts, his Huayang Pass will be able to hold on until next spring. Su Fengnian breathed a sigh of relief. Since he said so, then I don't have to worry about the rear. Su Fengnian had people lead Wu Lu Ding, swordsman Cui Hua, and Officer Xue to the side rooms of the 3 halls, while he and Su Yanbing went to the study. After Su Yanbing entered the study, he said in a low voice. Chu Lushan said something at the end. He asked you to remember that if you still want our Bailiang border army to have the last laugh, then the Great Snow Dragon cavalry and the 2 heavy cavalry cannot be used in this battle. Su Fengnian was silent. In the end, Chu Lushan just didn't want the Bailiang cavalry to die on the way to Huayang Pass. Bai Yu personally saw Qi Xianxia out of the city. Mr. White Lotus wasn't good at riding, so he sat in a carriage and Qi Xianxia followed on horseback. The carriage stopped north of the river crossing bridge. Bai Yu got off the carriage and Qi Xianxia led the horse forward. The 2 walked to the middle of the wooden bridge together. Qi Xianxia couldn't help but ask, Why did you come to North Resisting City to be the provincial governor of Liangzhou? Why didn't you stay in Liangzhou? Bai Yu rested his elbows on the bridge railing and propped up his chin. Looking at the slowly flowing river, he said calmly, On the one hand, if we stay in the Liangzhou provincial governor's mansion, we have to depend on others' whims and whims. We're firmly suppressed by Song Dongming, the deputy administrator overseeing Mount Qingliang. Rather than fighting in close quarters on a chess game that we're bound to lose and making us look ugly, it's better to switch to a different chessboard. Of course, this reason is far-fetched and is only used to convince myself. Even a layman like you might not be willing to believe it. In fact, the reason why I chose to follow the new Liang prince to North Resisting City, other than hoping to become a more trusted official than Song Dongming, was also selfish. Qi Xianxia frowned. Selfish. Bai Yu turned his head slightly and asked with a face full of smiles. Do you know what a scholar's ambition is? Qi Xianxia, who was already in a bad mood, snorted and said unhappily, A boorish man like me doesn't understand the ambition of scholars like you. Bai Yu blinked. Do you really not understand? Or are you pretending not to? Qi Xianxia kept a straight face and didn't say anything. Bai Yu didn't want to get to the bottom of it and looked at the river again. However, he took a step back, shook his sleeves, and straightened his clothes. In an era, in a country, someone has to stand out resolutely at a certain moment and stand in a certain position. Just stand there. Not one step back. As long as you stand there, you have an unshirkable responsibility. On the battlefield, Lu Jinu of Huta City and Wei Jingtang of Hengshui City were like this. In the court, Zhang Julu was even more so. Now, it's the turn of the new prince of Liang, Su Fengnian. Bai Yu narrowed his eyes and looked into the distance. I don't care what Su Fengnian's goal was or what his original intentions were, but in the end, he chose to stand there. In any case, I, Bai Yu, only look at the results and don't ask for the reasons. Therefore, I also chose to stand here. Whether it's merits or demerits, allow me to die and let your descendants judge. Bai Yu laughed and said, I don't like it when the later generations depict this soul-stirring war. I don't like it when the scholars of the later generations flip through that book and discover that in the end, not a single scholar died here. Qi Xianxia sighed softly. Bai Yu suddenly said sadly, in the past I didn't feel much, but now I'm beginning to realize that in the conversations of the officials of the Central Plains, there's a lot of mockery towards Bailiang. Those condescending and pointing fingers are so detestable. Qi Xianxia suddenly mounted his horse and said in a low voice, Let's go. If I listen any longer, I'm afraid I won't be able to leave either. Bai Yu laughed loudly. Go back to your Central Plains. As expected, Qi Xianxia squeezed his horse's belly and urged it to leave. Bai Yu didn't continue to watch Qi Xianxia leave. In any case, he couldn't see clearly, so he didn't want to waste his energy. Bai Yu suddenly slapped the railing of the bridge and sang loudly, The wind blows. My Bailiang is strong. Wang Linquan, who was jokingly called Bailiang's god of fortune, left Mount Qingliang Wutongan with a smile after seeing his daughter Wang Chudong. However, when there was no one around, Wang Linquan's smile faded. This old man, who was the wealthiest person in Qingzhou and the wealthiest person in Bailiang, was only left with a face full of exhaustion. Su Weisheng had privately told him something. As Wang Chudong's father, he couldn't refuse, but as an old soldier of the Su family, he couldn't rest easy. Chapter 1979. Zhao Yute, who used to be Princess Consort Wu Su's sword attendant, gently pushed the wheelchair and arrived at the shore of Tidehark Lake with Su Weisheng. This armored woman wanted to say something but hesitated. Su Weisheng said softly, Aunt, I won't go to North Resisting City. You shouldn't go either. Zhao Yute asked in a trembling voice. Why? Su Weisheng folded his hands on his knees and looked at the famous Tidehark Lake. He said calmly, We'll only distract him if we go. He'll have to arrange a retreat for us behind our backs and pretend to be happy in front of us every day. It's so tiring. Zhao Yute's hands trembled. Su Weisheng tilted his head and rested it on the back of Zhao Yute's hand. And, if that day really comes, help him take care of Wang Chudong and go to the Central Plains to find a paradise far away from the flames of war. Okay. Zhao Yute nodded with difficulty. In Wudong Courtyard, the young female literary master who had won first place with The First Snow was racking her brains because she had just promised to write a masterpiece for someone that would not lose to The First Snow. She would write about the smoke of the Northwest, about the war at the border, about those brave deaths, and about those magnificent scenes. She would clear his name and give voice to Bailiang so that their names would be immortalized for generations to come. She couldn't allow future historians to throw dirty water at her. The slightly thin and haggard Lu Chengyan sat beside her. She was taking a break from her work to help the famous master Wang grind ink. Wang Chudong suddenly looked up and said with a bitter face, Sister Lu, I haven't written for so long that I don't know where to start. Lu Chengyan smiled gently. Writing is a work of nature. Don't be anxious. Wang Chudong made an "oh" sound and continued to ponder over her work. Lu Chengyan slowly got up and rubbed Wang Chudong's head. Take your time. Wang Chudong suddenly smiled and waved her fists. Don't worry, I'll definitely come up with ideas. When the time comes, no one can stop me. Lu Chengyan smiled. When the time comes, I'll be the first to read it. After Lu Chengyan walked out of the house, Wang Chudong, who had always given everyone the impression of innocence, suddenly burst into tears. A carriage passed by the battlefield of Crone Mountain, where the smell of blood still lingered. A young general with a pale face stood up with difficulty and lifted the curtain to look, unwilling to put it down for a long time. That female bodhisattva of Mount Lautua was sitting in the carriage, in charge of preventing his injuries from worsening. She had to constantly impart a stream of peaceful qi to him. Xie Shibian looked at the abandoned Beimang corpses on the battlefield and said softly, 20,000 monk soldiers. Although most of them belong to the other powers of the Lantua Mountains, but your 3,000 direct disciples are also amongst them. More importantly, they are all your 6-jeweled heavenly jewel master. I'm sure you can guess why I want to go to that corridor, right? The female bodhisattva, whose hair almost reached her waist, nodded indifferently. Xie Shibian gave a bitter smile and said, this is killing 3 birds with 1 stone, and I have no choice but to do it. Not only would they be able to intercept Northern Mang's reinforcements as much as possible, they would also be able to turn the originally useless monk soldiers into a surprise force in Flo Province. In the end, they would naturally be able to whittle away at Western Region's reserves. Regardless of whether Northern Liang won or lost, there would only be benefits. If they won, the severely wounded Lantua Mountain would most likely have no choice but to continue sending monk soldiers to Northern Liang for the sake of pursuing benefits. If Northern Liang's Su family lost, in the future, Northern Mang would lose at least 20,000 monk soldiers if they wanted to seize the opportunity to invade the Central Plains. In the end, it is Beiliang who has the upper hand, and your Lantua Mountains can only be led by the nose. She sneered and said, you, the main culprit of Western Border's disaster, if you died in that corridor back then, if Lu Province's border army also suffered a great defeat, I would have removed your head without the slightest hesitation and brought it to Northern Mang to ask for rewards. Xie Shibian smiled and said, I'm sorry to disappoint you. After saying this, Xie Shibian had no choice but to put down the curtain. He lay back down and quickly fell into a deep sleep. She continued to close her eyes and rest, without sorrow or joy. She silently recited a passage of scripture to release the souls of the dead. Inside and outside Huayang Pass, Southern Chu and Northern Dong, 2 of the world's most famous fatties, were in a standoff. Dong Zhuo rode his horse to the front lines and raised his head to look at the top of the walls outside Huayang Pass. More than 20,000 sinners who had lost their identities from the grasslands were besieging the city like ants. Dong Zhuo, who had a personal army of 140,000 soldiers, did not have the extravagant hope that these 20,000 soldiers would be able to break through Huayang Pass. He did not even think about taking the outer walls. Dong Zhuo was patiently waiting for winter to come, waiting for the arrival of a heavy snowfall. Before that, using 20,000 soldiers who had no choice but to throw away their lives to deplete the forces defending Huayang Pass was very cost-effective. These 20,000 soldiers were only obtained by Dong Zhuo, and that old woman without spending a single tael of silver. Once he used the wealth of his father-in-law's Yelu family, he could borrow another 20,000 strong men from the grassland's great picker. In addition, Dong Zhuo had already sent a message to Heshi Prefecture's Jiefeng Helian Wuwei. If you can't take the towns of Fuling and Liuya before winter, I'll borrow soldiers to help you. Don't be polite. I, Dong Zhuo, will be unprecedentedly generous. When the veteran General Helian Wuwei, who was famed for his ability in warfare, heard this, he did not even bother to reply. He launched a large-scale assault on the city, day and night. His offensive was far more powerful than that of Huayang Pass. Dong Zhuo habitually tapped his teeth together like the world's softest drum. Chu Lushan stood on the walls of the inner city and similarly gazed at the assaulting army in the distance. Chu Lushan was clad in iron armor and exuded an awe-inspiring aura. The Beiliang Protector General crossed his fingers and tapped them together expressionlessly. Beimang's crown prince, Yelu Hongkai, did not ride a carriage. Instead, he wore golden armor and rode a horse in the middle of the army. Looking around, the grassland cavalry stretched out endlessly. It was said that in history, the emperors of the Central Plains had to ride a giant chariot pulled by 8 horses. However, the grassland did not follow this custom. However, this crown prince felt that after he became the ruler of the Central Plains, he could change this custom. He did not think that the emperor, whom he feared from the bottom of his heart, would actually be willing to let him hold real power and not be a puppet. The Cheshui army around him that only listened to him was proof of this. Although the appearance of Yelu Dongchuang and Chun Zhemo and Tuoba Chiyun was a bit of an eyesore, it did not affect the overall situation. As long as he took every step carefully, those two would not be able to cause any trouble. One of them had a grandfather who was a senior official of 3 dynasties, while the other's father was the Baemang god of war. Their backing was indeed frightening, but could they compare to him? Out of the corner of his eye, he inadvertently saw the woman sitting high on the horse beside him. It was his wife, the crown princess in name. If it was said that he was quite respectful to her in the beginning, and treated her honestly, and there were many times when she was his backbone, an existence that he needed to look up to. But after that person quietly appeared, the relationship between husband and wife became more and more distant, almost going from treating each other as a guest to treating each other as cold as ice. Thinking about the lover that was destined to never be revealed to the public, the Baemang crown prince felt a little regret and guilt. However, compared to the country and the central plains that had never had a ruler of the grassland, the choice was obvious. Who asked that Baelyong young man surnamed Su and his so-called 300,000 cavalry to be so useless and about to become his prisoners? The Baemang crown prince was filled with pride for the first time. He wanted to roar out loud. I have 400,000 cavalry under me. How can a lone north-denying city stop me? Chapter 1980. In the night, candles as thick as a baby's arm were lit in the meeting hall of the mansion, illuminating the spacious hall as bright as day. The generals and generals in the hall were gathered together, possessing a kind of invisible brilliance, which complemented the brilliance of the lanterns in the hall. The commander-in-chief of the Northern Liang Cavalry, Yuan Zuozong, and great ancestor Gu, Chen Yunchue, were the 2 deputy commander-in-chief of the infantry troops stationed in Liangzhou. There was also Yang Shenxing, a deputy military governor who had truly integrated into the Northern Liang border army. Lu Dian, who had previously been the deputy general of the Great Snow Dragon Cavalry as the deputy general of Yuzhou, was now in charge of a heavy cavalry. There were also Chao Xiaojiao, Hong Xinjia, and the others who specially came from Yuzhou, as well as a large number of generals and captains who were temporarily summoned to North Jebei City, such as Lingzhou's deputy commander Wang Ji and Huang Xiaokuai, the 2 Tongguan captains who guarded the east gate of Liangzhou, Lingzhou's Fengqiu captains Zhu Boyu, Beigua captains Ren Chunyun, and Zhao Wui who replaced Huang Xiaokuai as the Pearl captains. Many generals gathered together to discuss how to defend North Jebei City. Among them, Hong Xinjia, who built the Gord Wu Fort's beacon system single-handedly, actually did not have a high rank, but at this time, together with the young lord and the 2 deputy commanders of the border army, they were all listening attentively to the details of defending the city. A large number of green-robed counselors were present to listen. Madman Hong Shuwen was undoubtedly the fastest promoted legendary figure in the White Horse Righteousness. At a young age, he was already the commander of a provincial cavalry army under Lingzhou's general Han Laozhan. This time, he followed the 2 deputy commanders to North Jebei City outside the pass. This valiant warrior who had followed His Royal Highness to the Central Plains Jianghu and rushed to the Iron Gate Pass of the Western region to kill Prince Zhao Kai of Liang was not present in the hall. Instead, he stood at the gate with his saber in his arms and closed his eyes to rest. His aura was cold, like a merciless door god, who would draw his saber at anyone who disagreed with him. Liangzhou's provincial governor Bai Yu, Liangzhou's chancellor Wang, and Southern Border's Grandmaster Cheng Baishuang walked over together. After the 3 of them met, they hit it off and chatted happily. Chancellor Wang then sneakily took out a few pots of green ant wine that he had kept for a long time and pulled the 2 scholars to drink together. An hour ago, after the counselor informed him that there would be a meeting in the main hall tonight, Chancellor Wang, who was in a good mood, felt a bit embarrassed. If he staggered into the heavily guarded main hall with the smell of alcohol all over his body, it would be inappropriate. Besides, Chancellor Wang didn't have that kind of courage. He was already so old, so no matter how thick his skin was, he really couldn't endure the sharp gazes of those crude generals. Chancellor Wang clearly knew who was the soft persimmon in this North Jebei City. It was not Li Gongda or Yang Shenxing, this kind of old fox, nor was it Bai Yu, this kind of gentleman. It was not even that group of hot-blooded military counselors. It was obviously the young king. Even if the old gentleman did not keep his mouth shut and leak the story of how he came out by leaning on the wall, wasn't it all loud thunder but small raindrops? He was only defeated by the young king who flew into a rage out of humiliation on the chessboard. Other than that, Chancellor Wang did not dare to show the slightest strange indulgence of a famous scholar. The reason was very simple. The old gentleman knew that the civil and military leaders of Baelyong would never fall for this trick, and the old gentleman himself was not good at it. Therefore, Chancellor Wang only dared to pull the 2 people to the entrance of the meeting hall after using all his strength to disperse most of the wine smell. As a result, the door god at the entrance did not stop the distinguished and elegant Mr. White Lotus, but he stopped Chancellor Wang and Chang Baishuang. Bai Yu, as the little celestial master of the Celestial Master Mansion on Mount Longhu in the ancestral court of Taoism in the past, also vividly carried forward the style of sacrificing friends rather than oneself. He turned a deaf ear to the old gentleman's request for help behind him. After striding over the threshold, he only turned his head and cast a helpless look. Chancellor Wang had originally promised Cheng Baishuang that they could enter the meeting hall hand in hand, but his old face suddenly became bleak. He first gave Cheng Baishuang a heroic smile, indicating that she could rest assured that he would take care of everything. Then he turned around and whispered to the young general, saying that His Highness trusted this Grand Master of Southern Border very much and that Cheng Baishuang was a person with a strong character, so she would definitely not cause any trouble, let alone leak military secrets. Hong Shuwen held his knife with both hands and completely ignored him with a straight face. No matter how the old gentleman lowered his head to flatter him, he just blocked the door and refused to let him pass. Chancellor Wang, who was talking until his mouth was sore, could only act shamelessly. He didn't care about being a scholar anymore and glared at him. Hong Shuwen, do you believe that the king will not let me enter the meeting hall if I cry out my grievances at the top of my lungs? Lunatic Hong, who was impervious to everything, was still indifferent and sneered. Old man, just shout. When the time comes, as long as the king agrees personally, I will make way. Otherwise, based on your ridiculous smell of alcohol, I would have really gone all out with you today. The old gentleman glared at him like a bull's eyes. Hong Shuwen said lazily, What? You're not convinced? Chancellor Wang wants to bully me just because you're older than me? The old man almost spat out a mouthful of blood on the body of this shameless young general. The old man was indeed a person who learned real knowledge from reading books. He lowered his voice and stretched out a finger. Hong Shuwen sized him up from the corner of his eyes and his face was filled with disdain. The old man reluctantly stretched out 2 fingers as though he was parting with something precious. Hong Shuwen muttered to himself, Scholars are just not straightforward. The old man took a deep breath and stretched out a palm to slap the arm of this young man heavily. He said with a face filled with grief, I only have this much. Killing people is just a matter of time. Hong Shuwen, give me a straightforward answer. Hong Shuwen raised his eyebrows and shifted his feet to make way for him. He said with a smile, After the meeting ends, I will personally go over to your side to get the wine. 5 pots of green ant. If you dare to miss even 1 pot, I will tear down your etiquette wing. It's only a few steps away anyway. Also remember, don't get too close. Just stand at the edge of the room with Counselor. The grief-stricken old man didn't even try to bargain and hurriedly crossed the threshold. He didn't forget to turn his head and whisper to Cheng Baishuang, Old Cheng, it's a cool breeze and bright moon outside, the scenery is pleasant. I won't accompany you. When Chancellor Wang was about 7 to 8 steps away from the door of the meeting hall, he suddenly turned around and pointed at Hong Shuwen. His face was filled with the expression of a petty person who had achieved success, mixed with the action of rolling his eyes and shaking his head. Hong Shuwen immediately realized that the 5 pots of green ant wine that he had agreed on earlier were definitely wasted. He raised his leg and made a kicking action. Chancellor Wang hooked his finger, looking like he was asking for a beating. However, when the old man saw that Hong Shuwen was about to barge into the meeting hall with a sneer, he immediately slipped away. Hong Shuwen wasn't surprised. He turned around and continued to hug his knife with his eyes closed. It was an eye-opener for Cheng Baishuang, a Mr. White Lotus who spoke elegantly and was proud of himself, a Right Chancellor of Shangyin Academy, who almost dominated the literary world in his early years. How could he be so shameless when he came to Bailiang? Cheng Baishuang, who cultivated both civil and martial arts and had profound attainments in both, didn't know whether to laugh or cry. However, he didn't get angry and didn't leave in shame. Instead, he stood outside the door of the meeting hall and looked inside. He asked softly, May I ask this general, can I stand here and listen to the meeting inside the room? Hong Shuwen didn't open his eyes and said in a bad mood, Since the prince allowed you to walk around the residence as you wish, then as long as you don't cross the threshold tonight, it doesn't matter if you stand outside the door and listen. Even if you lie down, I won't stop you. Cheng Baishuang, who almost had the aura of a Confucian sage, dismissed it with a smile. Previously, when he was drinking and chatting with Chancellor Bai Yu, Cheng Baishuang heard a lot of interesting anecdotes. The speaker didn't mean it, but the listener listened attentively. Bai Yu said that the young prince would occasionally leave the study room on the right side of the signing room and go to the room on the left side of the signing room, which was called the Vegetable Garden by North Jeju City. That was the headquarters of the military counselor. Because these young people with different backgrounds didn't have any official rank, they only wore the green robes of Confucian scholars. When they gathered together, it looked like a green vegetable garden. Moreover, these people were the students of Baelyang. Whether they were born in Baelyang or scholars from other places, they all took root and grew up in North Jeju City. From time to time, Su Fengnian would go there to sit, regardless of day or night. There were no long speeches. He just chatted with those scholars who were mostly of the same age. Most of them were trivial matters. At most they talked about writing articles and learning. On the contrary, they rarely talked about the important matters of the country. The word peace was used to govern the country, and the war at the border was not mentioned much. Once Mr. White Lotus had nothing to do, so he joined in. That night, a king of Baelyang and a provincial governor of Liangzhou were surrounded by dozens of scholars in green robes. They were talking and laughing. When a military counselor said that he was willing to go to the battlefield and kill the enemy without hesitation, the young prince didn't refuse or approve. He just looked around and saw the young faces of the scholars. Only then did he tell the impassioned scholar that the scholar was the one behind the scenes. He was willing to give advice for the country's affairs. He was willing to speak out for the country's affairs. He was willing to fight to the death for the border army. This was a great contribution that no one could forget. Besides, if you scholars were willing to die, it would be a good thing. But I, Su Fengnian, would never advocate this. From Su Xiao to me, we have always believed that the Baelyang cavalry was guarding the border. Since they were outside the border, with cold sabers on their waists and horses on their waists, it was natural for them to die on the battlefield when they couldn't retreat. As for the scholars who were not good at archery and horse fighting, it was enough to have the heart. Baelyang didn't want to, and shouldn't ask you scholars to sacrifice your lives. It could even be said that it was understandable that scholars who had never experienced the smoke of war were afraid of death and cherished their lives. Scholars in the study and warriors on the battlefield each had their own duties. The former used the tip of the pen to write righteous words to express their feelings, while the latter wore armor to defend against the enemy. You do your job and I do mine, so that I have a clear conscience. As for the ordinary people who lived in the streets and alleys, they shouldn't be expected to come to the border to kill the enemy. They should live a peaceful life. Chapter 1981. Cheng Baishuang put his hands behind his back and turned his back to the meeting hall. He looked at the archway and fell into deep thought. As the emergency strategy was formally finalized, there were many generals hurriedly leaving the meeting hall in batches. In the end, even great ancestor Gu and Chen Yunchue, the two border generals stationed in North Jebei City, also stepped out of the door. The young king and Chancellor Wang finally walked out side by side and came to Cheng Baishuang, who had been standing at the door for nearly 2 hours. Bai Yu had already gone to the house to discuss matters. He was destined to stay up until dawn, so he didn't have time to greet Cheng Baishuang. The young king saw the southern wilderness master who relied on the opportunity of the Confucian sage to reach the great celestial state in Wudong Mountain. Su Fengnian chuckled softly. After Chao Chongqing and Shenyuan Jingqing, there will finally be another Confucian sage in the world. The three of them walked down the stairs together. Cheng Baishuang shook his head and said, "Limited by the pattern, I can't reach the realm of Confucian sage." Su Fengnian wondered, "What do you mean?" Cheng Baishuang smiled and said, "Even now, I still don't have the state of mind to establish a heart for heaven and earth, to inherit the lost knowledge for the past saints, and to create peace for all ages." Su Fengnian nodded, but he didn't look down on the old Confucian scholar. Cheng Baishuang suddenly asked, "Your Highness, what do you think is a scholar?" Su Fengnian thought for a moment and replied, "Scholars rule the country, peace and prosperity." Cheng Baishuang asked again, "In troubled times, when the country is in trouble, what should scholars do?" Su Fengnian said without hesitation, "Don't ask too much of them." Cheng Baishuang smiled and asked, "Shouldn't scholars rise up resolutely to save the country?" Su Fengnian smiled and dismissed it. "That's none of my business. The responsibility of scholars is chosen by scholars themselves. Whether they are willing or not, whether they dare or not, whether they can do it or not, it's all the scholar's business." Cheng Baishuang seemed to be a little surprised by this statement. After a long silence he smiled and said, "That's true." At daybreak, outside Jebei City, A horse galloped from Lu Zhou's Old Woman Mountain to the east of Jbei City. Before approaching the city gate, Lu Huang suddenly pulled the reins and stopped the horse. Turning his head, he saw a man who was far away from the battlefield but was still clad in iron armor and had 2 sabers at his waist. The man was looking up and smiling at him. Lu Huang dismounted from his horse and felt an extremely unfamiliar strong murderous aura from his senior brother. He couldn't help but ask, "What about that Xie guy?" Groom Yu sighed softly. "I can only say that he's not dead yet. Xie Shibian's injuries are extremely severe." Lu Huang didn't say anything more. Groom Yu hesitated for a moment. "Junior Lu, I have a favor to ask of you." Lu Huang said without hesitation. "Just say it." Groom Yu said sadly, "I might have to trouble you to bring little green robe back to the Central Plains. I've traveled a lot with her. I originally thought that she would be able to stay carefree at Tide Listening Lake on Mount Qingliang, climbing trees and catching fish with her peers, and then slowly grow up. Now it seems that it's going to be very difficult." Lu Huang shook his head. "You can ask Su Fengnian to find someone else for this matter. I can't help you." Groom Yu frowned. "You also want to stay?" Lu Huang snorted. "Could it be that only you, Groom Yu, can be heroic and I, Lu Huang, can't be heroic for once?" Groom Yu was speechless. Lu Huang said regretfully, "It's a pity that you and I don't have a good sword for the time being." Groom Yu patted the cold saber at his waist and smiled. "After using it, I found that it's very useful. I don't even need to carry the saber away. It's quite carefree." Lu Huang joked, "Why don't you share one with me?" Groom Yu decisively refused. "Don't even think about it." Lu Huang clicked his tongue. "I also want you to promise me something." Groom Yu smiled. "Let's hear it first. We'll see if you agree or not." Lu Huang grinned. "If I kill more people than you on the battlefield outside the pass, how about you call me senior brother in the future?" Groom Yu patted this junior brother's shoulder and said earnestly, "Although a junior brother who doesn't want to be a senior brother isn't a good junior brother, as a senior brother, I can understand this feeling. Unfortunately, I still won't agree to it." Lu Huang didn't feel surprised. He led the horse forward with a smile on his face. In the many years in Eastern Sea's Martial Emperor City, the two of them didn't have any interactions and wouldn't chat casually like this. Groom Yu, who seemed to be easy to talk to but was actually the hardest to talk to, was too talented, too good of a bone structure, too high of a cultivation, and too deep of a comprehension of the sword. Therefore, even if he had the best temper among all of Wang Xianji's disciples, he would give others the feeling that he was looking down on you. Lu Huang really couldn't like that kind of Groom Yu. The current Groom Yu and his junior brother, Lu Huang, who was extremely competitive, couldn't be hated. Groom Yu suddenly said, "If I can leave Bailiang's border alive, I will find a graceful and charming girl and find a peaceful and quiet village to spend the rest of my life with." Lu Huang nodded. "Not bad." Groom Yu sighed. "It is very good. However, I am also quite worried right now. With my appearance as a bridegroom, finding a beautiful young lady from northern Liang's Tuaji County would be a piece of cake. But junior martial brother, with your appearance, what should I do? What if I see a girl that I don't like and want to introduce her to you, but they only like me? It will be very difficult for me." Lu Huang took a deep breath. He took another deep breath. Only then did he resist the urge to beat him up. At noon, in a secluded courtyard of the feudal residence, a white-haired, white-clothed, one-armed old man raised his cup and drank wine leisurely. This old man, who was addicted to swallowing the world's famous swords, was not only of the same generation as Lu Songtao. Not only did he compete with Li Chungang in the way of the sword, but he was also the master of the West Shu Sword Emperor and Qingliang Mountain's sword Jiuhuang. Chapter 1982. On the opposite side of the stone table was the current head of the Dongyue sword pool, Chai Qingshan. Although Chai Qingshan's status in the pugilistic world and reputation in the Central Plains was much higher than the reclusive sword-eating ancestor, in terms of seniority in the pugilistic world, the 70-year-old Chai Qingshan was still 1 or even 2 generations younger than Sui Xiegu. Sui Xiegu had once visited the sword pool when he was 30 and defeated an elder of the sword pool with the surname Song. The latter was already 60 years old at the time. Although he was defeated and his sword became Sui Xiegu's delicacy, the elder still held Sui Xiegu in high regard before he passed away. He saw Sui Xiegu as a fellow swordsman. When the young Chai Qingshan entered the Dongyue sword pool as an outsider, he became the brother of the previous head of the Dongyue sword pool. He was taught by the previous head of the sect, Song Nianqing. Therefore, when he finally saw Sui Xiegu in person today, Chai Ching-shan bowed respectfully. Sui Xiegu recalled the past and said slowly, "Back then, whenever Li Chun-gang defeated a famous swordsman in the pugilistic world, I would follow closely behind and join in the fun. However, after some swordsmen lost to Li Chun-gang, their sword hearts were covered in dust and their sword wills were shattered. Naturally, I had an unfair advantage." At this point, Sui Xiegu glanced at Chai Ching-shan and sneered, "Song Yanqing's father, your master, was such a person. He could not afford to lose, and after being humiliated, he died in depression. On the other hand, although your martial granduncle's swordsmanship was not as good as his nephew's, his temperament was clearly more tenacious. After losing to me, he trained himself for 20 years. When we fought again, he still lost. But do you know what that 100-year-old old man said with a smile when he saw me break his sword with his own eyes?" Chai Ching-shan shook his head. Sui Xiegu narrowed his eyes and sighed. That old man laughed and said that his mother's life was only 100 years. How could a 3-foot sword be enough? This old man still wants to practice swordsmanship in his next life and the next 100 years. Chai Ching-shan was silent, but his mind was filled with longing. Sui Xiegu said calmly, "Speaking of which, your master's swordsmanship was destroyed. His heart was not strong enough. After all, as the head of a sect, especially in the Dongyue sword pool, which had a long history of swordsmanship, he probably had to bear the burden of his family's prosperity since he was in his mother's womb. Naturally, it was hard to let it go." Chai Ching-shan, who was still the head of the sword sect, sighed. Sui Xiegu said, "It's even harder." Chai Ching-shan was stunned. At this moment, Hong Shuwen, who did not leave North Jebei City with Wang Ji and Huang Xiaokuai, walked into the courtyard. He was holding a huge wooden box. His expression was as if someone owed him 1,000,000 taels of silver. He slammed the wooden box on the stone table. He stared at Sui Xiegu and said, "His Highness asked me to bring this to you. There are 6 swords in a box. Other than the 2 swords of Fuji of Shu, there are also the 4 swords of Jingshi and Dragon's Scale that were kept in Tide Listening Pavilion for many years." Sui Xiegu casually opened the wooden box. The sword chi was dense. The small courtyard was like it was in the middle of winter. There were indeed many peerless and famous swords, like each and every one of the beauties who were beautiful enough to cause the downfall of a city, but were kept in their boudoir. Sui Xiegu muttered to himself, "It's rare for that kid to make a loss." Sui Xiegu waved his sleeves and closed the sword box. He raised his head and smiled. "This is definitely not your Highness' original intention. If I'm not wrong, it's Su Weisheng's daughter's idea?" Hong Shuwen was not in awe of some sword-eating ancestor. He said unhappily, "I'm only responsible for sending the swords here." Just as the young man was about to turn and leave, Sui Xiegu suddenly opened his mouth and said, "4 swords should be enough for me to make a move. You can take back 2 swords. This old man is not someone who would take advantage of a burning house." Hong Shuwen bent down at lightning speed and opened the sword box. He hurriedly asked, "Senior Sui, may I ask which 2 swords of Fuji are?" Sui Xiegu laughed coldly and could not be bothered to answer. The sword was named Fuji. It was very easy to recognize. The body of the sword was long and narrow, and there were inscriptions on the scabbard. Hong Shuwen did not spend any effort to identify it. However, he was not sure which sword was the Fuji that was equally famous as Fuji. After much difficulty, he identified the other 3 swords. In the end, he had to choose between 2 swords. He was hesitant as he was afraid that if he took the wrong one, he would cause His Highness to suffer a huge loss. Sui Xiegu reached out and twirled his snow-white eyebrows with a playful smile. Hong Shuwen gritted his teeth and was about to pick up an ancient sword that looked like a Fuji. Just as he grabbed the scabbard, he heard Sect Master Chai of the Dongyue sword pool cough softly. Hong Shuwen immediately put down the long sword in his hand and grabbed the other sword in the black scabbard. He held one sword in each hand and laughed happily as he left quickly. Chai Ching-shan hesitated and said, "I hope Senior will not take it to heart." Sui Xiegu had an indifferent expression. "It does not matter." At dusk, an old man in scholarly robes who had taken off his Taoist robes slowly walked towards the bridge towards the north. A tall woman in white blocked his path on the bridge. The old man did not care. He walked onto the bridge and asked with a smile, "Celestials, why are you making things difficult for immortals?" The woman with snow-white eyes said coolly, "The heavens will not tolerate the actions of great rebels." The old man smiled and pretended to be surprised. Oh! The tall woman was the Qi cultivator Grandmaster Tantai Pingjing. Her gaze grew sharper. Zhao Chongling. You were not suppressed in the water-moon sky well back then because the heavens had given you a way out. I advise you not to reach for a yard after being given an inch. The old man made a sound of acknowledgement. So what? She stood in the middle of the bridge. If you dare to come forward, even if I have to fight Su Fengnian, I will destroy your soul. The old man laughed. You scared me to death. The old man suddenly stopped smiling. Pity, I am the immortal of the heavens, Zhao Chongling. Chapter 1983. Facing Zhao Chongling, who called himself an immortal, Tantai Pingjing showed a hint of disdain. Banished immortals are banished immortals. Do you think that you are a Taoist spiritual master of the mortal world, and that no matter where you are seen as an unreachable immortal by the people? Tantai Pingjing was undoubtedly the only remaining great grandmaster of the Qi cultivators in the mortal world. She exposed Zhao Chongling's past. When immortals came to the mortal world, they were no longer immortals of longevity. They were like a powerful central official who had been banished out of the capital and wandered thousands of miles. While they would not become homeless dogs, their power was far less than in the past. When in Rome, do as the Romans do, and follow the local rules. Back then, in the battle outside the Imperial Astronomer, Su Fengnian had used his power to kill countless ancestors of Longhu Mountain who had walked out of the statues. He had the advantage of the mortal world. If Su Fengnian was someone who had ascended from the mortal world, and met so many ancestors of Longhu Mountain who had achieved longevity, he would undoubtedly lose. Compared to Zhao Chongling's bravado at this moment, Tantai Pingjing was more curious about how this person had been able to escape the heavenly way, and escape as a scholar after death, and not become an incomplete soul in the well. Zhao Chongling did not continue forward. He stood near the railing of the bridge and looked at the quietly flowing river. The river flowed endlessly, and did not give up day or night. The old man dressed in ancient spring and autumn scholarly robes had his hands behind his back as he thought of the past. He frowned as though he thought of many heavy matters that could not be mentioned. One of the three great demons of the spring and autumn period, the butcher Su Shao. This great general of Liang whose achievements shocked the emperor, his life could be divided into two parts. Before this, he had worked for the old emperor of Liang, Zhao Li. After that, the incense that the Su and Zhao families had accumulated over the years was almost completely gone. Zhao Dun had won the battle for the throne, and the new emperor had been the most meritorious official of the previous dynasty before ascending the throne. There was a grudge between the two families. The Su and Zhao families started to be strangers. Zhang Julu's court reached the top, and opened the peak of the imperial court's secret encirclement and suppression of the Bailiang frontier army. In the imperial examinations, there was a threshold for Bailiang scholars to enter the bureaucracy of the Central Plains. He used Kai Nan, a direct descendant of Gu Jiantang, and the Duke of Huainan Zhao Ying to work together to impede the Bailiang. In the end, the Su family, including the Su family, became non-human beings. They lived in a corner of the northwest of the Central Plains, and were not seen as people of the Central Plains. The reason why Li Yishan was seen as the least outstanding of the top strategists of the spring and autumn period was largely because after Zhao Chongling's death, he did not turn the tide and successfully help the Su family and Bailiang integrate into the Central Plains. This caused the Zhao imperial court to view Bailiang as a great threat. Because of this, the Su family and Zhao families had no victories to speak of. The Su family's cavalry, as the cornerstone of the border army, had never received the financial support of the Central Plains. On the other hand, the Zhao family also buried the roots of the two Guangling River rebellions. While they secretly pushed for West Chu to revive, and barely achieved the goal of weakening the vassal kings and generals, the progress of the war was not smooth. The loss of Liang's power was great, clearly far exceeding the expectations of the old Grand Secretary Zhang Julu when he was alive. This caused the ambitious Yen King Zhao Bing, who had been bitterly suppressed in the south for 20 years, to develop the desire to fight for the Central Plains. Similarly, the Su family also continuously fought bitter battles, greatly damaging their vitality. Even though they obtained a great victory in the first great battle of Liangmang, the northern Mang cavalry still wasn't willing to pinch the Liangliao border army and the Ji province border army that were even easier to deal with. They decided to first go down to northern Liang and then swallow up the Central Plains. That was why from the current situation, northern Liang's Su family, Liang's Zhao Shi, and the northern Mang Empress, all three of them had lost. On the contrary, It was the Yen King Zhao Bing and that puppet king Jingon Zhao Sun who was about to proclaim himself emperor who benefited the most. As for the great pillar state Gu Jiantang who had been biding his time until now, how this martial artist of the spring and autumn four great generals would make his decision was still full of suspense. With Zhao Chongling's assistance, even though Su Zhao's achievements shocked the emperor, he was not cooked by the hounds. He was given the title of king and spent his later years in the northwest border. After Zhao Chongling died on the western Shu battlefield, it was Li Yishan's turn to support the Su family alone. But now, with the 400,000 cavalry of Bei Mang pressing against the northern city, the young king was likely to die young. The two Su family strategists, Su Zhao's right and left arms, had obvious achievements. Zhao Chongling did not insist on going north into the city, so Tantai Pingjing did not attack. A crossing bridge could create a world of its own. With Tantai Pingjing's superb celestial being cultivation and her great luck, it might be a little far-fetched to ask her to open up a fairyland. However, it would be very easy to just isolate the other celestial being senses and set up a prison at a certain time and place. Zhao Chongling said to himself, in the spring and autumn period, I was a strategist, and a strategist to my bones. Also, unlike the sages of the Qin dynasty, who were not nobles, I, Zhao Chongling, came from a top-class family. So at that time, the rulers, ministers, and ministers of the countries were willing to treat me as an honored guest even though I was in the enemy camp. I went out on generals' orders again and again, and was always successful. I won the reputation of unhindered eloquence and unparalleled flexibility. Some of the scholars under general's command even felt that I, Zhao Chongling, could shoulder both strategy and decisiveness, and did not need Li Yishan, who came from a poor background, to worry. Zhao Chongling slowly shook his head and said emotionally, how would the world know that this is not the case? Righteousness is Confucianism on the outside, and Tao on the inside. This is the foundation of the Su family's army, and caused General to be able to keep on fighting in the spring and autumn war. In the end, I, Zhao Chongling, am just the face of the Su family's cavalry, and the icing on the cake. Righteousness is indispensable, and is helping General in his hour of need. 20 years ago, righteousness might not have been able to do better than me, or worse. But in the spring and autumn war, I am far inferior to righteousness. I fear that the so-called 300,000 Bailiang cavalry in the world has already fallen apart, or become a wedding dress for others. Zhao Chongling suddenly turned and smiled. The heavens are clear, and retribution is not good. Sect Master Tantai, are you curious why the heavens have opened a path for me? Tantai Pingjing was cold and silent, and did not speak. Zhao Chongling did not care. He looked up at the sky. Because among my disciples, Chen Zhibao, Yao Jian, Yi Shizhen, and General's brother-in-law Wu Qi are all important pawns to the immortals in the heavens. Chen Zhibao is especially important. Of the spring and autumn war, the Zhao family of Liyang destroyed 8 countries and took them into one. They are at odds with the north and south of Bei Mang. This is still the arrangement approved by the immortals. But if one side can rest for 20 years and unify the world, the territory of the dynasty far surpasses the Qin at its peak, and then the people of the world will obtain peace for at least 100 years, it will go against the original intention. Zhao Chongling looked away, and pointed at North Jebei City. So even if Su Fengnian can succeed in inheriting the throne, he should die outside Liangzhou Pass, under the hooves of the grassland warhorses. Then the Bailiang cavalry will be given to Chen Zhibao. He will guard the northwest, and form a triangle with Liyang and Bei Mang. The 3 sides will fight for supremacy, and the flames of war will never end. In the end, the Zhao family of Liyang will be able to continue for more than 100 years. During this time, the Bei Mang grasslands will fall into internal strife. After that woman's death, the imperial family's Yelu Dongchuang, his relative Murong Baoding, and the military's leader Dong Zhuo will be in a triangle. The internal strife will not end, and they will be greatly weakened. Chen Zhibao will take the initiative to attack twice. The first time, he will attack the grasslands in the north. He will fight all the way to the heart of the Bei Mang court, but he will be trapped in the cold weather and cannot make the final decision. In his twilight years, he will choose to attack Liyang. The latter will send an envoy to the grasslands, and at the great price of ceding Jizhou, ask the grasslands to send troops to harass Chen Zhibao's Liangzhou rear. Chen Zhibao finally reached Great Peace City but was unable to break through. He regretfully retreated, and had no chance of taking over the world. The emperor of Liyang, Zhao Zhuan, in his prime and in his later years, fought 2 great battles against Baelyang. There were no results. Liang lost but did not fall. Baelyang won but lost the overall situation. In the end, the king of Baelyang that Chen Jibao created will die after 3 generations, and he will withdraw from the fight for hegemony. Zhao Chongling laughed out loud. This may be the earliest trend of the world in the eyes of that strange person, Huang Longshi. But it is a pity that the talented Su Fengnian sought his own death. He changed the established situation on the spur of the moment, and caused Su Fengnian's rise to be unstoppable. It forced Chen Jibao, who retreated in order to advance, to still be unable to smoothly take over the 300,000 cavalry. Everything is in chaos. If Zhao Ningxin invited the first grandmasters of Longhu Mountain to fight Su Fengnian at the Spring God Lake, it was just a clever test by the mastermind behind the scenes, to test the bottom line of a certain great person in the heavens. Then after Liang Zhaoshi broke the rules and invited the grandmasters of Longhu Mountain who have been worshipped for countless years. The immortals in the heavens turned a blind eye, and broke the rules they set. As to the recent almost blatant plans to increase Baimang's power, they are shedding all pretense. Chapter 1984. Zhao Chongling pointed at the sky, and then at his feet. His smile was slightly mocking. Actually, everywhere is the same. There is no faction fighting. Some things have to be done before they stop. One side finished singing, the other side appeared. You go back and forth. In fact, many ancient sayings from the human world have already explained the principles of the heavens and the world. Finished. To tell you the truth, the important person who chose you, Tantai Pingjing, used immortal methods back then to make the heavens give me a way out. This is not his act of rewarding a meritorious official, but some things have to be cleaned up. Otherwise, if there is evidence left behind, it will not be easy to clean up. Also, he needs me to help keep an eye on Chen Jibao. Otherwise, how do you think Chen Jibao could become a fake Confucian saint so quickly after becoming a king and vassal of the Western Shu sect? It is not that there is no such thing in the world, but it needs to be accumulated over a long period of time to make the water flow into a canal. Chen Jibao becoming a half-step Confucian saint was like pulling up seedlings to help them grow. It was forced on his fate. There was no other way. Huang Longshi caused trouble. First, he pestered endlessly and was extremely rude. Then, he handed it to Su Fengnian to continue playing. Originally, with Chen Jibao's temperament and foundation, he could naturally become a Confucian saint in the future. Tantai Pingjing finally asked, after Chao Chongqing died, of the 3 portions of fate, the largest portion was scattered to the Guangling sect. The smallest portion was intercepted by me. The 3rd portion was a transaction. It was the prerequisite for the first portion to successfully merge into the Old West Shu territory. This last portion should have gone to Western Shu. Why was Chen Jibao unwilling to accept it? Zhao Chongling was very proud. After inexplicably becoming a half-baked Confucian saint, how could my proud disciple not sense it? Later, he cooperated with the ambitious Xie Feiyu. The two appeared to be united, but were divided at heart. Chen Jibao was just feigning civility. Also, with his conceit, how could he be willing to accept a favor that was so easily obtained? The disciple that I, Zhao Chongling, chose, Chen Jibao, is a great talent that has not appeared in 500 years. Tantai Pingjing sneered and said, the founding emperor of the Great Feng dynasty reincarnated as a banished immortal. He is indeed worthy of the saying that he has not appeared in the world for 500 years. Zhao Chongling asked with a smile, Tantai Pingjing, do you want to know which immortal you are? This old man can answer your questions and tell you about your past and present lives. The great Grandmaster Qi refinement warrior, whose nature had always been close to the ruthless nature of heaven, seemed to have his reverse scale touched. He flew into a rage for the first time and said sternly, How dare you? Zhao Chongling smiled and said leisurely, If I have no hatred in my eyes and do not believe that there will be white hair in the world, the ancients did not lie to me. Tantai Pingjing narrowed her eyes with murderous intent. Although her snow-white robe looked calm on the whole, ripples could be seen on it if one looked closely, like fine spring water flowing through a bluestone. In the river under their feet, a slender unknown wild fish suddenly jumped out of the water and then fell back into the water. Zhao Chongling smiled knowingly. Tantai Pingjing also smiled. You've done everything you can to ruin my state of mind. Are you hoping to tell Su Fengnian in North Jebei City where we are? Zhao Chongling waved his hand and said, From the start of my journey to the north, you have been hiding from the heavens. I only sensed a little, but the Su Fengnian knows that the core world of this bridge is just your camouflage. I, Zhao Chongling, am not so naive as to think that with a few words, I can destroy the South Sea Guanyin sect's centuries-old imperturbability. You used the fish under the bridge as a test to try and break my last reliance, the immortal mind left behind after losing the immortal body. Sect Master Tan Tai, you and I are both smart people. Tan Tai Pingjing looked pitifully at the strategist of the spring and autumn period, the chief strategist of the Su family who had firmly suppressed Li Yishan when he was alive. She said with a smile, cleverness overcomes cleverness. Zhao Chongling, do you know where you are inferior to Li Yishan in my view? Zhao Chongling ignored the female Qi cultivator grandmaster's question. He frowned and turned to look at North Rejecting City. His gaze was complicated, puzzled, shocked, and in the end, understanding and disappointment. Tan Tai Pingjing walked forward to the south and brushed past Zhao Chongling. She said softly, Poison Warrior Li Yishan is the most emotional. No matter the situation, status, fortune or disaster, in the depths of Li Yishan's heart, he is always willing to be kind to the world and choose to trust people. You are different, Zhao Chongling. So the person you choose to inherit your legacy will only be Chen Zhibao. Li Yishan will choose Su Fengnian. Zhao Chongling stood in place, back to back with Tan Tai Pingjing who was slowly walking forward. I lost. Tan Tai Pingjing, you will also lose. Tan Tai Pingjing did not stop. She walked down the bridge and headed south without looking back. A dignified voice faintly sounded in her ears. Ordinary people, foolish beyond compare. Blood immediately gushed out of her ears. But there was a gentle smile at the corner of her mouth. She murmured, I am willing. Wherever she passed, this tall female Qi refinement grandmaster would constantly emit golden light. Her pair of treacherous snow-white eyes returned to normal. Zhao Chongling stood in place and sighed softly. A rainbow light landed on the bridge. It was the young vassal king who had hurried over from North Reject City. When the fish had jumped out of the water, the movement had seemed subtle. Zhao Chongling, who was in the world, had not been aware. But for Su Fengnian in North Reject City, it was like thunder. It was enough to see how chaotic Tan Tai Pingjing's state of mind had been at that time. Su Fengnian came to the bridge. He had to be wary of this old scholar who had disguised himself as a fortune-teller and was able to hide from his perception. He was no less wary than the great Peace City eunuch of the same age as the country. Zhao Chongling was not in a hurry to announce his name. He asked with a smile, the books say that all good things must come to an end. The books also say that it is a small world. But in the end, since people have life and death, life is a parting. Why don't you guess who I am? Su Fengnian was unmoved. He looked to the south at the tall woman who, for some reason, chose to dissipate her own fortune and give it back to the world. Su Fengnian did not urge her to stay. He did not know how to do so. Without Tan Tai Pingjing holding him back, the banished immortal Zhao Chongling looked around and said leisurely, Some scholars seem to care about the world, but in reality they are arrogant. In the end, they only see the empty world, and disdain the country under their eyes. For example, I am one of them. Some scholars care about the country and the world. In the spring and autumn period, only Huang Longshe and Li Yishan are like that. Su Fengnian frowned and said, Who are you? Zhao Chongling took advantage of his seniority and said, Didn't I ask you to guess? Su Fengnian seemed to be weighing the pros and cons of attacking. Zhao Chongling did not seem to notice. Your mind is not calm. What, the Beimang army is pressuring you, causing your mind to be as heavy as weeds. This is not a good sign. If you fight the blessed Tuoba with your present state of mind, you have no chance of victory. At most you will die together. Zhao Chongling sighed and looked into the distance. In the past, the Chu had a powerful family, the Zhao family, who had been in power since the founding of Dafeng. They had a 300-year feud with the Su family of Western Shu. Later, they formed a deep grudge because of the Sweet Dew crossing south at the end of the Dafeng years. The Su family suffered and did not go to Guangling River, but instead opened a new path and luckily entered Western Shu. During the spring and autumn period, the Su family, who had become the family name of a country, tried to resolve the grudge and turn hostility into friendship. They took the initiative to form a marriage alliance with the wealthy Zhao family of Guangling. The Zhao family also wanted to have Western Shu as a paradise during the chaos of war, so they agreed to this marriage. A woman who bore the responsibility of the family married far away to Western Shu. In the end, she lost in the struggle for favor in the palace and lost to a woman who also came from the spring and autumn period. Su Fengnian said, "This woman was Zhao Chongling's sister. The two of them relied on each other since childhood, and the elder sister was like a mother." Zhao Chongling nodded and said, "Yes, the younger brother rose up in the family because of the elder sister. His talent and ambition were finally displayed. In the end, other than waiting for the bad news of the elder sister's death, there was only the elders of the family saying, 'This woman asked for it, her death is not regrettable.' Now that things are like this, we cannot blame the Shu Su family to avoid making things worse." The most hateful thing was that after the Western Shu emperor learned the truth, he did not feel regret. At a banquet, he smiled and said to the Guangling Zhao family emissary who had gone to mend the relationship that in the future, when the Zhao family members enter Shu to travel, they should be treated as honored guests. Only that annoying Zhao Chongling dares to ask for an explanation. An explanation? My will is the will of the heavens. If Zhao Chongling dares to go to Shu, I will treat him as an enemy. As time passed, the pain and sorrow were like an old dog lying on the ground, powerless to whimper. Su Fengnian said with a smile, "I fear that the ruler of the fallen country would never have thought that Zhao Chongling really went to Shu with 20,000 cavalry. On the Western Shu map, from the time Great Feng established the country as a commandery, to the spring and autumn period as an independent country, there has never been a foreign cavalry of more than 10,000. Zhao Chongling's lips jerked. "It is a pity that I did not see the Su family's cavalry charge into the capital of Western Shu. You have to know that the general once promised Zhao Chongling that as long as the gates of the Western Shu imperial palace were breached, Zhao Chongling would be at the front. At that time, it would not be a problem to kill with his own hands, or to sit on the dragon throne." Su Fengnian exhaled, turned and bowed to the old scholar. He said gravely, "Su Fengnian greets Mr. Zhao." Zhao Chongling also turned and shook his head. "I am not worthy of this bow." Su Fengnian lowered his head and said, "Worthy." Zhao Chongling had no choice but to respectfully return the greeting. Chapter 1985. After the two stood still again, Zhao Chongling smiled and said, "Do not take what I said that day seriously. I have caused you to suffer for nothing these years. I, Zhao Chongling, am half of Chen Jibao's master, am the main culprit. This time, I am here to make up for it. But due to the heavenly path, or other important people, I cannot help you directly. I can only add some additional destiny to Beiliang. But this can only offset the additional destiny that Bei Mang has from the heavens. The celestials have their own rules. No one can truly cover the sky with one hand. After all, there are more people who do not think highly of Beiliang. This time, we have deceived the heavens. This is the limit of that person. You and I know that person." Su Fengnian was relieved. "This is already very good." Zhao Chongling shook his head and said, "But Tuoba has the body of a great Vajra realm celestial, and his comprehension of the profound finger and celestial phenomenon realms is astounding. The profound finger is the profound finger of the Taoist great longevity, and the celestial phenomenon is the celestial phenomenon of the scholarly saint. What kind of celestial is he? He will rarely meet a match in the heavens." Su Fengnian made a sound of acknowledgement, but said, "Tuoba may not be flawless. I have to look at the timing." Zhao Chongling said in surprise, "Why do you say this? I am curious." Su Fengnian blinked. "The mysteries of the heavens cannot be revealed." Zhao Chongling laughed joyfully. "Of course." Zhao Chongling's smile faded. "Let's wait and see tonight." Before Su Fengnian could speak, Zhao Chongling's figure flashed and disappeared. "I will walk around and take this chance to say some inhumane things to Ishan." Su Fengnian did not return to the study. Instead, he went straight to the backyard. Jia Jiajia was teasing the big cat. The so-called big cat was different from the stray cats in the streets. In fact, this cat was still young. It liked to eat bamboo, but it was not a vegetarian. The war was imminent. Whether it was for public or private reasons, Su Fengnian could not use the spies of the Fu Shui chamber and the soldiers within his borders to transport it to the north resisting city. Su Fengnian's intention was simple. If the situation became worse, the girl Jia Jiajia should not die here. He hoped that she could leave the north resisting city, leave the Guanyi, and even leave the northern Liang for the sake of this big cat. She could go to Western Shu, which had not been affected by the war, and take the big cat to a place where the bamboo was as dense as the sea. Su Ying's whereabouts were unknown. She should have left the city. Zhang and I sat on a small stool in a daze. Even when Su Fengnian walked in front of her, she did not come back to her senses. Su Fengnian smiled and waved his hand in front of her eyes. She finally woke up and glared at him. Su Fengnian sat next to her. I know you will not leave, but I hope you can do one thing. Only if you agree, will I let you stay in North Resisting City. Zhang and I nodded. Speak. Su Fengnian grinned. I will take it that you have agreed. Zhang and I widened her limpid eyes, her face filled with resentment. Su Fengnian put his hands behind his head and said softly, It is good to be alive. Zhang and I said in exasperation, Nonsense. Su Fengnian solemnly retorted, That's not nonsense. Zhang and I turned around and asked curiously, You just went out and floated here and there. How carefree. Don't tell me you accidentally hit your head on the ground and became stupid? Su Fengnian leaned forward and said with a smile, Why don't you touch it? Zhang Ni's face flushed red and she spat out 2 words with difficulty. Pervert. Su Fengnian sat up straight and rested his chin on his hands. He looked at the courtyard and sighed. In North Resisting City, Shenyuan Qingfeng found Su Yanbing and said that he wanted to fight. Su Yanbing was unwilling, and Shenyuan Qingfeng was even more unwilling. Su Yanbing was familiar with this crazy woman's personality. He did not give her a chance to attack and directly ran to the study of the manner to cultivate. Outside the North Barbarian City, a red robe swept across the sky, like a splendid red cloud that landed in the mortal world. 30 li east of North Resisting City, a woman in a veil hat stood beside a man in white. The former had a valiant appearance that made people forget about the difference between men and women. The latter had a graceful figure, but under the veil hat was a terrifying face covered in scars. Her eyes were dull and lifeless. Su Ying was overjoyed when she saw the man in white. Her red robe flew around the man in white. The man in white reached out and pressed his hand on Su Ying's forehead. The latter's body suddenly stopped in the air. After the man in white withdrew his hand, he glanced at the woman beside him and said indifferently, Among the 3 of us, you are the most miserable. That vixen and I have never even seen you as an opponent, but you think you have a place in that person's heart. After waiting for so many years, you finally divined that he would come to the human world, but you still did not have the time to meet him. Once again you will be separated forever. Why did you come? The man in white suddenly laughed. It's better if you don't see him. He will only be sadder if he sees you. In that case, this little idea of yours in the princess tomb is not extremely miserable. I only hope that you did not reveal your background to the Bei Mang before leaving the princess tomb. Otherwise, with those treasuries, it would be equivalent to letting the Bei Mang barbarians conquer half of the Central Plains in advance. Su Ying landed on the ground with a charming smile. The man in white, who was the #1 demonic cultivator in Bei Mang and Liang, rubbed Su Ying's head. Only you are the most fortunate, right? Su Ying only smiled foolishly. Luoyang in white laughed loudly. That city will soon be renamed as Luoyang City. Chapter 1986. The #1 person of Nanzhao, Wei Miao, lived in a small, secluded house in the North Resisting City. When he heard a series of urgent knocks on the door, he went to open it and saw an unexpected but reasonable face. It was the wife he had parted with on Mount Wudong. Wei Miao asked helplessly, What are you doing here? Didn't I ask you to go back to Nanzhao? She rolled her eyes and said, Go back your head, why do I need a man to accompany me? I can't sleep alone at night. Wei Miao said angrily, Go find one. She smiled charmingly and said, If I really bring a son of a bitch to you, I will smash your head with a punch. Wei Miao, who was invincible in Nanzhao, couldn't do anything to her. Knowing that she would never leave this time, he accepted his fate and led his wife into the courtyard. This woman, who was born in the 100,000 Barbarian Mountain, looked around curiously. That little handsome brother is too stingy, this house is not worth much. Wei Miao said, It's just a temporary residence, he didn't say that he would give it to us. She curled her lips. This melon child. Wei Miao lowered his voice and said, That person can hear you. She hurriedly changed her expression, as if the young lord was in the small courtyard. She said sweetly, This courtyard is very good. Wei Miao held back his laughter. In the end, This old man and his wife sat side by side on the steps. Although Wei Miao never thought that he and her were a celestial couple, after so many years of traveling in Jianghu together, they met countless heroines and fairies. Wei Miao didn't remember any woman at all. She leaned her head on Wei Miao's shoulder and closed her eyes. "I'm sorry, I can't give birth to a baby for you." Wei Miao stretched out his rough palm and gently caressed her cheeks. He helped her wipe away her tears. This simple and honest man who had never said anything sweet said softly, "Even if there were 10 Wei Miaos, they wouldn't be good enough for you." "Wife, really?" Night fell. As day and night alternated, a series of thunderous noises suddenly sounded in the sky outside the Bailiang Pass. For some reason, only the young king could hear and see it. The other Wu Dao grandmasters, who were as powerful as Dong Tai, didn't notice anything unusual. Zhao Chongling appeared on the city walls and laughed. "Everyone, if we do not descend now, what are we waiting for?" An immortal in the sky echoed loudly, "De Chu is the Central Plains." The scholar took off his shabby Taoist robe and put on a scholarly robe. "Li Mi. What De Chu?" "It's West Chu." A beam of magnificent rainbow light descended into the mortal world and landed on the top of the North Jebei city. It came with a menacing momentum, but it was silent. Another immortal said loudly, "How can our glorious Central Plains sink under the iron hooves of the grassland?" Another immortal laughed boldly in the sky. 300,000 cavalrymen guarding the northwest gate of the Central Plains, fighting to the death for 20 years without retreating. It's fortunate to see it with my own eyes. Another immortal walked out of the heavenly gate and stretched. My De Feng dynasty was useless in the past. Now it's up to your Bailiang cavalry. A tall and sturdy immortal in black armor looked down at the mortal world. "Oh, the grassland barbarians put on such a big formation. You think you're so great just because you have more people." Immortals and rainbow lights crashed into North Jebei City one after another. Dozens of banished immortals from different dynasties became Bailiang's fate tonight. The banished immortals fell like rain to the mortal world. The young king with a cold blade at his waist stood under a loquat tree. Zhao Chongling's scattered figure suddenly appeared in front of him. Su Fengnian wanted to say something but stopped. The old man reached out. While he could not touch Su Fengnian's body, it was like he was patting the young king's head. There is meeting and there is separation. Fate comes and goes. Do not be sad. Su Fengnian raised his arms and cupped his fists. He pursed his lips and did not speak. The old man said regretfully, "It is a pity that I cannot help you more." Su Fengnian kept his back straight and cupped his fists like a common poplar tree in the northwest desert. Living and not dying for 1,000 years, dying and not falling for another 1,000 years, dying and not falling for another 1,000 years, dying and not falling for another 1,000 years. The old man's voice was erratic and unclear. He glanced at the new cold blade at the young king's waist and was gratified. "Good blade." Su Fengnian's lips trembled. The old man smiled. "The general told me to pass a message to you. He said that Su Zhao's greatest achievement in his life was not marrying your mother, but giving Bailiang to you. But he felt sorry for you and made you suffer." Su Fengnian shook his head. The old man said softly, "Xiaonian, princess consort, said that in the past, she always advised you not to get into conflicts with others easily. She hoped that you could be like a gentle and refined scholar. However, if someone makes you angry in the future, it would be a waste not to beat them up." Speaking of this, the old man looked helpless. In his impression, the princess was not such a woman. The young man nodded gently with tears on his face. The thin old man closed his eyes and seemed to be listening attentively. He said sarcastically, "Huh? It seems that I heard the sound of the horses of my Su family's iron cavalry? And it is quite loud." The old man opened his eyes and asked Su Xiao as he did when he was in his prime. He asked with a smile, "What should we do?" Prince Su Fengnian loosened his fists and reached out to hold the hilt of his blade. He laughed loudly. "What should we do? It's very simple. Kill them. In the end, only the sound of the horses of my Su family's iron cavalry will be left on the battlefield." The old man finally closed his eyes. Before his soul dissipated, this strategist seemed to be reminiscing about the past and imagining the future of peace and prosperity. He said softly, "Xiaonian, that's right." Chapter 1987. Year 3 of Xiangfu, Autumn. The yin energy grew heavier, and the dew turned white. The coldness of the Central Plains was the heaviest at the northwest border. In the twilight, 400,000 grassland cavalry troops set up camp outside of Jbei City, endless and endless. The war horses neighed, gathering like thunder. From time to time, there were dozens to hundreds of small groups of cavalry coming out of the battle formation and approaching the North Rejection City quickly. Then, when they were at the edge of the shooting range of the crossbows, they raised their heads and looked up, pointing their horsewhips and sabers at the top of the city wall in an arrogant manner. Just on the north city wall of Jbei City, there were 40 of the expensive ballistae that were hailed as the most important weapon of the country. Their range and power were far beyond the imagination of the grassland. The spring and autumn war armor Yi Bai Kuei had once exclaimed on the west wall battlefield, 9 oxen crossbow, 1 arrow can destroy a mountain, 300 steps, can kill a grandmaster. However, for some reason, facing the Beimang cavalry troops that were outside the range of normal crossbows, the Bailiang city wall ballistae did not move at all. They did not show any signs of using this top-grade weapon to show off their might. Beimang had actually already experienced the power of the Hutu city ballistae. However, the group of grassland pickers that were responsible for sieging the city, at that time South Yard King Dong Zhuo attacked Hutu city without caring about the casualties, causing the other divisions to suffer heavy casualties. Today, most of them were still licking their wounds in the grassland territory and did not participate in this southern expedition. In the first battle of Liangmang, General Yang Yuanzhan, who led the army to attack Heluku, Yuzhou, died for his country. If Bailiang didn't want to exchange the head of this old general for the corpse of Lu Jinu in Hutu city, Yang Yuanzhan's body would probably continue to be one of the piles of bones in a certain capital temple at Heluku. As for Deputy General Zhong Tan, who made meritorious contributions in breaking Huagong City and Heilwan City, he was defeated in the Battle of Miyun and was still imprisoned in Jubiai City. Dong Zhuo was in the north mainly attacking Huayang Pass and did not follow the army to the south to Jubiai City. Therefore, the Beimang army's impression of Bailiang was still the word, iron cavalry. Of course, this was all thanks to Dong Zhuo, who used a stratagem to break Hutu city. Even though Dong Zhuo had resigned as the king of South Courtyard, he had reminded his colleagues in the southern imperial court that Hutu city, the first town in the northwest border, was extremely difficult to attack. The magnificent new city outside Liangzhou Pass, which was built by Su family for 20 years, could not be broken in a short time. The grassland cavalry's way to the south was like jumping over a natural moat, so they had to be prepared for the worst. It was a pity that Dong Zhuo had already lost his prestigious title as the king of the southern courtyard, so his words carried a lot less weight. Secondly, in the first battle of Liangmang, Dong Zhuo deliberately held back his strength and wantonly depleted the grassland forces for the sake of that old lady. His reputation in the northern and southern capitals was getting worse and worse. Finally, in the officialdom of the two imperial halls, they all felt that Dong Zhuo was deliberately exaggerating, saying that attacking the new city of Bailiang was as difficult as ascending to the heavens. It was nothing more than that Dong Zhuo wanted to show off his military exploits, since he had already achieved great merit in taking down the Hutu city. He still hoped that one day he would be able to unify the power, and once again ride on the necks of all the great generals and give orders. Outside the city, there were grassland dignitaries galloping on their horses, shouting domineeringly, "Grandpa is here! That coward surnamed Su from Bailiang, do you dare to come out of the city and fight?" Some grassland generals with astonishing strength even pulled their bows like a full moon, urging their horses to gallop forward, the bowstrings pulled taut. After a thump sound, the arrows shot toward the city gate of Bailiang City, swiftly and violently nailing into the city gate, the feathers of the arrows trembling non-stop. When these famous archers of the grassland turned their horses back, they won the deafening cheers in front of Beimang's main camp. It turned out that the catapults behind the cavalry were constantly advancing south along the gaps in the main camp. There were more than 900 catapults in total. In addition to the 1,400 catapults that Wang Yong, the military governor of Aquarius, would escort to the battlefield before dawn, there were 2,300 catapults in total. Moreover, there were so many boulders that it was said that they had emptied the two opposing mountain peaks in the southern dynasty's Dragon Waste state. It was said that His Majesty the Emperor of Beimang and the military governor of Taiping had personally taken the time to go there. The old woman who wore a dragon robe and spoke of the heavenly law had personally conferred the two mountains as the mountain gods of the state. She had promised that when Bailiang City was breached in the future and the grassland finally unified the Central Plains, the two mountain gods who had temporarily lost their foundation would be able to rule over the two mountains respectively. Among the siege weapons, other than the catapults meticulously built by the Southern Dynasty's military weapons supervisor Beimang, which did not hesitate to exhaust its national resources to fight this huge battle, also had more than 100 siege towers that were as tall as Baelyang City. Because the siege towers were originally built to target Huta City, they had to be temporarily raised after the more majestic and towering Baelyang City was built. For this reason, nearly 10,000 young and able-bodied craftsmen were urgently hired to work through the night to avoid delaying the battle and causing His Majesty the Emperor's anger. Because of the huge scale of the project, the Southern Dynasty's imperial court put even more pressure on the military weapons supervisor. As a result, the officials in the weapons supervisor, from top to bottom, appeared to be thin and bony. However, when it came to the construction of the catapults and the addition of the siege towers, it was rumored that the officials in the weapons supervisor earned a lot of money just by relying on this extra income. This was ridiculed by a depressed Hongjia remnant who wrote a poem, in which there was a line, "Skinny and bony with a bulging purse, two sleeves originally not a clear breeze," which was widely circulated. It was specifically used to ridicule the officials in the weapons supervisor for stuffing their own pockets and profiting from the national disaster. The Southern Dynasty's military weapons supervisor in Baymang had 3 departments: armors, crossbows, and siege towers. The siege weapons such as the siege towers all belonged to the siege towers department. The supervisor did not expect this matter to be spread so widely both inside and outside the imperial court. He was on tenterhooks and almost wanted to resign and apologize. Unexpectedly, His Majesty the Emperor, who had always been lenient to the Southern Dynasty's aristocratic families, actually issued an order to arrest the scholar from the Southern Dynasty's Ding clan and execute him for the crime of misleading the public with his lies. What really made the supervisor feel relieved was a private conversation with the supervisor of the military weapons supervisor. The supervisor said that His Majesty the Emperor had personally seen the items made by the supervisor and believed that there were no flaws. The materials were of excellent quality. Since this was the case, it was already a great contribution to the grassland and a little windfall was not a big deal. Apart from this, the Southern Dynasty, which had always imitated the Central Plains in opening up courier routes on a large scale, built 3 more courier routes within half a year to transport grain and fodder. Although the provinces to the north of the Dragon's Waste Prefecture did not exhaust the National Treasury's financial resources like the Dragon's Waste Prefecture, they also opened up a courier route to the Dragon's Waste Prefecture. On the fertile grassland in the north, there were easily hundreds of thousands of cattle and sheep that followed the soldiers of the grassland down south. All of this was undoubtedly to pave the way for the Battle of Baiju City. At the same time, almost all the resources of the Southern Dynasty were tilted toward the Dragon's Waste Prefecture that bordered the Liangzhou Pass. This was also the reason why Dong Zhuo was able to easily obtain a large number of grassland youths to besiege the Huaiyang Pass. Before the First Battle of Baymang, Tuoba had purged the forces of the grassland and the North Court. A large number of refugees and sinners who had lost their protection had to go to the battlefield and rely on military merits to regain their identities. At that time, because the main force of Yang Yuanzhan's southern expedition was unexpectedly annihilated, the middle army of Baymang also failed to break through Huta City. This gave the Baelyang frontier army some breathing room. It was believed that this time, Baymang would not retreat so easily. Even though Huang Songpu had died in the Battle of Liuzhou, ending up in the same miserable state as Yang Yuanzhan and becoming the highest-ranking general of Baymang, the Baymang emperor did not hesitate to let the crown prince, Yelu Hongkai, take the position of regent and lead the army down south to Baiju City. She personally guarded the west capital to calm the people down. Baymang was determined to win this battle. It was probably because the silence of Baelyang's Baiju City had increased the arrogance of the grassland generals. In addition, the crown prince who personally led the expedition did not give orders to restrain the valiant generals under his command. Leading the elite cavalry out of the camp seemed to have become an unwritten rule of the Southern Dynasty's border army and the grassland's North Court. It was as if not going to Baiju City was an act of cowardice. In the beginning, not to mention the silent and ferocious large arqueballistas, even the ordinary city-guarding bows were nothing. They rode their horses forward, hating that they could not ride their horses up to the top of the city wall. Some young generals from the North Court wore gold and silver armor, dazzling under the setting sun. To these young grassland dignitaries who had been promoted from the cowardly Shuiwei to the centurion or even chilly arch of an army, they had been tired of hearing about the independent Liang border army since they were young. Calluses grew in their ears. They even had a lot of silent criticism. They felt that among the people whom His Majesty valued in the South Court, other than Fatty Dong who had some ability, Huang Songpu, Yang Yuanzhan, and Lu Gui were not worth mentioning. If His Majesty did not welcome Hong Jia and those stray dogs who had fled to the grassland to seek refuge in the north and inexplicably made an alliance for the Southerners to govern the Southerners, how could Huang Songpu and the other old fellows who had an undeserved reputation become great generals? After two riders left the camp, they did not go straight to the north resisting city, but instead rode slowly along the outskirts of the camp. These two riders were young. They wore ordinary armor and sabers, but one of them had a Xianbei buckle jade belt on his waist, which allowed them to travel unimpeded. This young man was none other than Yelu Dongchuang, a member of the king's tent of Bei Mang. Yelu Dongchuang's Xianbei buckle was also divided into high and low ranks, according to the number of gems embedded on the jade belt. Most of the children of Yelu and Murong could embed 2 or 3 gems, and then the number of gems would increase according to their military exploits. Murong Bao Ding, a member of the royal family who held military power in his hands, or Yelu Hongkai, an appointed minister of 3 dynasties, who was Yelu Dongchuang's grandfather, could embed 8 gems. Yelu Dongchuang's Xianbei buckle originally only had 6 gems. After he was conferred the title of Zhenghua General and Assistant Minister of War of the Western Capital, he added a large cat's eye stone to one of the 4 military towns, including the tiles of Gentleman's Pavilion. He should have stayed in the Western Capital Temple or one of the 4 military towns at the border of Gusai Prefecture. But this time he made an exception and followed the army to the north resisting city. He and the young knight beside him were both middle army supervisors. Chapter 1988. Yelu Dongchuang was short and dark-skinned, but he had the ferocious aura of a wild wolf. He turned around and smiled at the young man beside him. Tuoba Chiyun, you've made great contributions, but we can only stare at each other. Don't you feel aggrieved? The other young man was Tuoba Chiyun, the eldest son of Beimang's military god, Tuoba. He was the leader of the 4 great Chunjibo in the grassland. Compared to Xia Chunjibo, Zhong Tan, Qiu Chunjibo, Bo Er Hui, and Dong Jabo King Jing Chong, he had a stronger background. Originally, Zhong Tan was the most favored one. Not only had he experienced the first battle of Liangmang, but he had also made great contributions in Yozhou's Crouching Bao City and Heilwan City. As long as he could successfully recruit the Buddhist forces in Beimang's Lantua Mountain, he would have a meteoric rise in the southern dynasty. In addition, his family had a strong foundation. His father, Zhong Shintong, was one of the 14 great generals of Beimang. Zhong Tan was even expected to become the next general without the title of king, Dong Zhua. In the future, it would not be an extravagant hope to have 1 or 2 kings in the Central Plains. Now that Zhong Tan was missing in the western regions and no one knew whether he was dead or alive, Chunjibo and Tuoba Chiyun had one less natural enemy. Tuoba Chiyun said calmly, with your status as my father's family, as long as we take down North Rejection City, we won't have to worry about not having enough military contributions even if we are napping the entire time on horseback. Yelu Dongchuang frowned and said, judging from Chunjibo's tone, you think there are still variables in taking down North Rejection City? Tuoba Chiyun hesitated and turned to look at the tall and majestic city in the afterglow of the setting sun. Forcing Bailiang's main force to dismount and fight may not be a good thing. Yelu Dongchuang laughed. You scholars have too much knowledge, but there's one disadvantage. You like to be afraid of this and that, but we have to fight a war. Tuoba Chiyun dismissed it with a smile. The famous scholars of the Central Plains like to play chess with their hands. There's a saying about golden horn silver edge grass belly. In the previous 3-front war, Bailiang only won the gourd city in Yuzhou, which made Dongzhua's main force retreat to the north. This is the proof. Yelu Dongchuang twisted his wrist and gently waved the horsewhip. Now that we've been defeated at Old Woman Mountain, even the 50,000 elite cavalry of the Southern Dynasty border army that went to reinforce us were surrounded like dumplings. Are we going to repeat the same mistake? Tuoba Chiyun shook her head and said, on the contrary, we should go down south to attack North Resisting City. This is actually the intention of the Taiping Decree. They want to exchange the western capital of the Southern Dynasty for North Resisting City. Those survivors of the spring and autumn period, who fled from the Central Plains to the grasslands have gradually gained a foothold after 20 years of growth. They have a vague tendency to become too powerful to be removed. In fact, His Majesty is not without concerns about this. In the entire 4 provinces of the Southern Dynasty, the power of the civil officials is deeply intertwined. Even the Longguan clan, who has always been extremely xenophobic, has to lower their status and marry them in order to secure their position. This is enough to show the great influence of the nobles of the Central Plains. In the long run, I'm afraid that the survivors of the Southern Dynasty will turn from knives to swords. Even if they have a knife, they will still hurt themselves. Yelu Dongchuang grinned, like a wild wolf baring its teeth. It was especially creepy. In this case, as long as Bailiang has the courage to mobilize the main force of Liangzhou in the Qingyuan region and rush to Liuzhou, we can let them invade the hinterland of the Southern Dynasty. After all, those who die are inextricably linked to the survivors of the spring and autumn period. We can just take it as helping the grasslands to eliminate some hidden dangers. It's fine if they kill by mistake. In the end, the Western capital's temple will be completely clean. It's equivalent to the cavalry of Bailiang helping His Majesty to be the executioner. The Taiping decree is really ruthless. Tuoba Chiyun sighed with emotion in a low voice. This kind of method, maybe he learned it from the people of the Central Plains. Yelu Dongchuang curled his lips. When we take over the Central Plains, I'll definitely make those scholars suffer and make them disgrace themselves. Chun Jubo did not answer. He only glanced at the majestic and silent silhouette of North Resisting City. It was like a mainstay standing before the flood of the grassland cavalry. It quietly gathered the vigorous fate of the Central Plains in the past 800 years. Within the siege of Beimang's western capital, an old woman with a hunched back walked under the walls. Her small and slow steps just happened to step on the boundary between the afterglow of the setting sun and the thick shadows. Beside the old woman silently followed the Taiping decree of the chess and sword music school. He was an imperial tutor and an old man whose ambition did not lie in North Resisting City in the northwest but in Great Peace City in the Central Plains. The old man suddenly said, "Why does His Majesty not allow Yelu Dongchuang to stay in Gusai to stop the cavalry of Liuzhou?" Dong Jubo King Jing Chong pulled back 10,000 cavalry from the border of Liang and Liao. Before the defeat at Old Woman Mountain, it was enough to deal with Yul Wandao's Yuzhou cavalry. But now, it is inevitable that it is beyond their power. Although the collapse of the Southern Dynasty does not affect the overall situation, it is still for His Majesty's sake. Even if the older generation of Hongjia people have retired from the officialdom, there is no lack of smart people. Perhaps they will be wary because of this. The old woman who did not have anyone to support her staggered forward. She coldly said, "I heard Li Mixi say that Wang Du has been well behaved for 20 years. Recently, I don't know if it is the final radiance of the setting sun or if it is for the sake of his descendants, but he has secretly contacted many important people. It is better to be safe than sorry. Little Wang Jing Chong. Let him sacrifice his life for the country. In any case, when the time comes, I will just bestow a dozen Xianbei coins and give old Wang Du a great title." Compared to the younger generation, the older generation of people like Wang Du who have survived until now are more like thieves. Back then, I had already paid close attention to their subtle influence on the officialdom of the Southern Dynasty. Unexpectedly, I was still unable to stop their infiltration. I was kind enough to take them in and give them a bowl of rice to keep them alive. In the end, they left me with such a mess. Chapter 1989. The old woman's tone grew heavier as she said sternly, "Our grassland cavalry has been fighting for hundreds of years. Since Dafeng Dynasty, we have been invincible. We relied on killing enemies. If we had selfish desires, we would divide the spoils after the war. How could we be like Gourd Mouth of Yuzhou and Old Woman Mountain of Liuzhou, who schemed before the war and were blinded by selfishness? If not for Wanyan Yinjiang from the Longguan clan, I would have used the cavalry of Liuzhou to help the South Dynasty. I would not have spared these Longguan parasites that have been living on the grassland for generations, including the Wanyan clan. They deserve to die. They deserve to die." The Taiping commandant sighed softly. The agitated old woman slowly calmed her emotions. She squinted at the bright and dark boundary under her feet. It was like the border between two countries, but also like the boundary between Yin and Yang. The old woman said slowly, "Yelu Dongchuang who has a good grandfather to help him strategize, my cousin Murong Baoding who believes in every man for himself, and even General Zhong Shentong, all of them have wild ambitions. They seem to be shrewd, but in my eyes, they are not as smart as Dong Zhua. Only Fatty Dong who is full of oil is the most adaptable. No one is willing to attack Huaiyang Pass because they don't have much military merit. Even if they succeed, only Chu Lushan's head can be seen. At that time, they will suffer great losses and at least hundreds of thousands of casualties. In this way, even if I agree to be conferred the title of Marquis according to military merit, without troops, an ordinary person will not be able to hold the position. Therefore when I asked Murong Bao Ding to attack Huayang Pass, the Jefeng commandant of Orange Province acted as if his parents had died. He asked for so many Ruran cavalry and still felt that it was not enough. He wanted to work but not put in effort. What is the big picture? He clearly knows the importance but he is unwilling to take care of it. How hateful! The old woman sneered, as long as Dong Zhuo can take Huayang Pass, even if he can't participate in the attack on North Resisting City, I will give him the title of King of the Southern Courtyard and let him lead the army into Bailiang Pass. The magistrate of Taiping frowned and said, that would be Chen Zhibao, who was conferred the title of Prince by Liang and is now a vassal of Western Shu. Letting the tiger return to the mountain is a disaster as big as the sky. The old woman laughed in a low voice. Legacy? We don't even have many days left to live, so why should we care about the life and death of the two ingrates of the Yelu and Murong family? The magistrate of peace was silent. The old woman comforted, Teacher, as long as the hooves of the grassland cavalry step onto Great Peace City, step onto the Guangling Road, step onto the southernmost land of the Central Plains, you and I will not be forgotten in history. As to who will sit on the dragon throne in the end, what does it matter if it is Yelu, Murong, or Dong? Taiping Ling smiled bitterly and said, if we can unify the world, then fewer deaths will be a good thing. The old woman laughed loudly and waved her sleeve. Then you'll have to endure for a few more years. Beimang's royal preceptor stood in place, his figure desolate. The old woman walked forward alone with her hands behind her back. The afterglow gradually disappeared under her feet. In the darkness, the old woman murmured to herself, maybe I won't be able to see the snow next year at your hometown in Liaodong's Jinzhou. Say, if I had not returned to my hometown back then and stayed by your side, would I have children and grandchildren now? The sky was about to brighten. In the back courtyard of the Northern Barbarian Manor, a room was lit by candlelight. A cold knife was placed on the table. A young man started to silently put on the Manor King's embroidered robe. Outside the room, there was a young woman dressed in white. She held a red sandalwood sword box with a determined expression. She quietly waited for him to come out. Also in the manor, Xue Songguan, who had not slept the entire night, slowly sat up. He put on his boots, picked up the guqin, and gently pushed open the door. The old spiritual master of Wudong Mountain, Yu Xingrui, had just finished practicing the fist technique he had created from his little sect brother, Hong Shixiang. Feeling refreshed, he carried his sword and left the yard. A white-clothed, white-haired, and white-browed old man sat on a stone bench. The sword box on the table was wide open. The old man held the sword in one hand and broke the blade inch by inch with 2 fingers. He gently threw it into his mouth as if he was chewing soybeans. The old man casually threw away the remaining sword hilt. He glanced at the empty sword box and slowly stood up with a smile. The 100-year sword aura filled his stomach. It was time to vent it out. On the stone steps of a small courtyard, the young swordsman who was the sword crown of the Wu family sword tomb squatted there. He suddenly stood up and turned to look at the swordsman Cui Hua, who carried the ancient sword Su of Gojoseon on her back. The latter opened her eyes for the first time and smiled sweetly at him. In a small courtyard, 2 disciples from Martial Emperor City walked out of their room at the same time. The handsome eldest disciple of Wang Xianji took off a cold saber from his waist and tossed it to the other disciple. The latter smiled knowingly and tossed one of the 2 famous swords, Fu Ji of Shudao, to his senior brother. The 2 of them. One of them hung the cold knife while the other hung the famous sword. Their movements were exactly the same. In the end, they hung their swords and sabers and strode out of the courtyard side by side. A middle-aged man with white cloth tied his legs turned around and waved at the Miao girl's wife who was standing at the door. She smiled and gave him a thumbs up. In the same quiet courtyard, an old Confucian put down the sage book in his hand and straightened his clothes. The old swordsman sitting beside him raised his cup and drank half of the wine in it. Then, he poured the wine on the unsheathed long sword. Outside the house, a burly old man stood with his knife in his arms. He closed his eyes and concentrated, waiting for his 2 old friends. In front of the meeting hall of the Northern Barbarian Mansion, under the wooden archway, there was someone holding an iron spear. Beside him stood the master of the Dongyue sword pool. Somewhere in the Northern Barbarian Mansion, a woman in purple squatted down and tied a small knot on her skirt. On the southern wall of the Northern Barbarian Mansion, an average-looking middle-aged swordsman sat cross-legged. He placed his sword on his knees and looked into the distance as if he was waiting for the sun to rise from the eastern sea. Not far from the city wall, a man in white stood. He was drinking happily with his head raised. The woman in the red robe beside him looked serene. After the young lord put on the python robe and put on the cold knife, he paused when he was about to open the door. Then, he suddenly opened the door. Baimang's army was about to attack the city. They were only waiting for dawn. Suddenly, a horse rushed out. It was the Baimang generals. When he was less than 100 steps away from the city wall, he laughed wildly and said, "Bullshit Bailiang cavalry. Until now, no one dares to go out of the city and fight." Chapter 1990. The sun rose from the East Sea, its rays reaching 10,000 zhang. Between heaven and earth, outside the northwest Great Wall, the sunlight was like a tide, slowly pushing from the east to the west, bringing endless light. The king's flag with the word Su on the top of the city wall and a large banner in the center of the Baimang camp outside the city were illuminated by the sunlight at almost the same time. Under the banner of Baimang, the crown prince of Baimang was riding a Fergana horse, his body covered in dazzling golden armor. He was looking at the top of the city wall in the south, his face full of satisfaction and a smile. Under the king's flag on the city wall, there was a drum platform that was more than 10 zhang above the city wall. A young woman dressed in white walked up the steps and stood in front of a large cowhide drum. She took off the sword case on her back and smashed it heavily on the ground. Then she took a step forward, seemingly hesitating. Finally, she took a deep breath, picked up the drumstick, and held it tightly. The old generals and soldiers of Baimang City who had experienced the Spring and Autumn War couldn't help but feel excited when they saw this scene. Perhaps the true backbone of the Bailiang Frontier Army, the most powerful Bailiang cavalry in the world, already belonged to Li Mofen, Lu Yanchao, and Ning Amei, these outstanding generals in their prime. It wouldn't even be long before the military power passed to younger generals like Yu Luandao, Chao Wei, Ko Zhonghuai, and Xie Shi. This was like a person's life and death. It couldn't be resisted. However, in the hearts of the old Bailiang soldiers, especially those who had personally experienced the Spring and Autumn War and the Battle of the Western Wall, the memory of the big drum and the white dress was still fresh in their minds. For this brand new city at the northwest border, the most important thing, second only to the hanging of the plaque, was not the official completion of the great general's residence, but the construction of the stage and drum set, which seemed rather inconceivable to outsiders. This big drum came from the treasury of Mount Qingliang and had been kept by the Su family for many years. Even the drumstick had a long history. The drum was made during the Battle of the Western Wall. After the butcher Su Shao was made king and took over the northwest, it followed the Su family's army into Bailiang. Since ancient times, there had been a saying in the military that one should advance upon hearing the sound of drums and retreat upon hearing the sound of drums. This was also the origin of the saying, "Beat the drum and beat the sound of drums." According to the teachings of the Yinyang school of the Great Qin dynasty, the birth of spring, the growth of summer, the harvest of autumn, and the storage of winter were all part of the natural cycle. Drums were made of wood, which symbolized the growth of qi. In the Central Plains, it was said that after the Su family in the northwest left the Central Plains and went to the border, the Bailiang barbarians had a tradition of, after the Western Wall, the Su family did not listen to the sound of the drum and only beat the drum. Most of the people in Liang were skeptical. No army in the world, no matter how majestic and elite, could truly only fight and not retreat. It must be an exaggeration. The drum was still the big drum made of cowhide, but the woman was no longer the woman from before. However, the sword box was still the same, the white dress was still the same, and the devastatingly beautiful woman was still the same. The woman turned her head to look at the horse path. The slender figure was slowly walking to the middle of the city wall, towards the top of the city gate where the horizontal board was hung. He was wearing the king's robe from Lingzhou's golden thread weaving bureau. Under the sunlight, the black and gold robe shone brightly. As if he had sensed the woman's gaze, the young man turned his head back and smiled at her. The beautiful woman, who was originally a little uneasy, suddenly calmed down. She had never told him that as long as she could see his figure, she would feel at ease. She lowered her head and glanced at the red sandalwood sword box by her feet. Then, she slowly raised her head with a determined look in her eyes. She held the drumsticks with both hands and was ready to beat the drum. Now, she was going to be like the female sword fairy Wu in the past. She was going to do it for Bailiang, for the northwest, and for him. Below the city wall, the generals of Baimang were shouting that no one in Bailiang dared to fight. His laughter grew louder. He leaned back slightly and raised his head to look at the city wall of North Jebei City. The tall and sturdy man from the grassland was arrogant and proud. He really did not care about the clanging iron armor on the city wall. However, when he saw the king of Liang's embroidered robe appear right above the city gate, he could not help but tighten his grip on the reins. He sat up straight and subconsciously pressed his hand on the hilt of his long saber. He didn't stop while he was ahead, immediately turning his horse around and leaving. Instead, he openly raised his head to look at the legendary king of Liang with a different surname. Behind this Dragon Waste province major who had 400,000 grassland cavalry as his backer, was a 400,000 grassland cavalry. Even though he felt a bit of panic inwardly, his burning desire for power suppressed that fear. He understood incomparably clearly that with the two armies clashing today, his words were destined to spread throughout North Jebei City. Soon, it would spread throughout the grassland's two capitals and northern Liang Pass. It would even enter the ears of the emperor, as well as that young monarch of Liang from Great Peace City. Even if he did not go to the battlefield to kill the enemy, this was already a monstrous military achievement. It would be heard by the heavens and no one could hide it. If he could say a few words to the young king of Liang, it would help him become famous in the two dynasties. Therefore, he calmed his thoughts and deliberately turned his horse around. He pointed his whip at the top of the city wall and shouted while knowing the answer, "You are Su Fengnian?" Unfortunately, the young man's gaze was cast on the Beimang camp as if he was looking for something. He did not pay any attention to the generals who had taken the first merit with just a few words. The Beimang generals who had asked for a snub were about to continue to provoke him. Unexpectedly, the knight in golden armor under the banner waved his hand. Horns sounded from the Beimang army and the siege began. The black mass of Beimang infantry took the lead and slowly moved forward from the north to the south like a swarm of locusts. Looking north from the top of the city wall, among the dense swarm of locusts, there were 2,300 catapults of different sizes. Under the busy supervision of the officials of the Southern Dynasty, they finally took root in various places and formed an arc with Beimang City as the center. Beimang's catapults were divided into 6 types. There were huge catapults that needed to pull more than 200 people and small catapults that could be successfully driven by 20 to 30 strong catapults. Compared to the first time Beimang's catapults appeared on a large scale in the Battle of Huta Town, this time not only the number of catapults was more shocking, but also the large catapults made up the majority. This naturally meant that Beimang City had to endure more terrifying, heavenly maiden scattering flowers. The downpour would not stop until Beimang used up all the boulders in the two mountains. Among the swarm of locusts, there were also special arquebulisti made by the Southern Dynasty army. Unlike the arquebulisti that were mostly used as defensive weapons in the Central Plains, Beimang naturally had the advantage of cavalry. The arquebulisti's function was very simple. They only needed to shoot arrows that were as thick as iron spears into the city wall to make it easier for the attacking infantry to climb up. The dare-to-die soldiers that were praised by the Beimang border army as the best soldiers in the Southern Dynasty would hide among the attacking infantry. They did not use obvious targets like scaling ladders or towering siege wagons to climb up the city wall. Instead, they gave up their shields and only wore light leather armor. With a saber in their mouth, they relied on the arrows that were inserted into the city wall to quickly climb up the city wall like wild monkeys. They acted as surprise troops to harass the defenders. Beimang's army was approaching the border. Other than the most eye-catching flag of the royal family, the grassland commander's flags were also fluttering in the wind. His Highness the Northern Mang Crown Prince suddenly frowned. It was because to the side of the divine steed beneath him, a sturdy and slow-built man suddenly appeared. He didn't wear any metal armor, nor did he carry a war blade. There was only a cloth pouch tied to his waist. The Crown Prince, who was personally leading the army, slightly bent his waist. He had the style of the Central Plains celebrities who were polite to the wise and asked with a pleasant smile, "Grandmaster Deng, why did you show up so quickly? Could it be that there are still people in Beimang who can fight their way here?" The man with a broken spear head in the bag kept silent. In just 3 or 4 years, the Grand Masters of Beimang were scattered. It was a bleak situation where Zhonghu was about to end. The head of the Tao morality sect, who had subdued a young Kailan with supreme magic, had already ascended and left the world. The 5th raccoon of Bubang Mountain died in the hands of Prince Liang. Hong Jingyan of the Chess and Sword Music School died in the Longyan Plain. The Grand Master of the Bronze Men was missing. A large group of Grandmasters, such as Xiao Xiong of the Princess Tomb and Tiechi Air, died in Bailiang Pass. Luo Yang and Huyen Daguan, the #1 person of the Devil's Path in Beimang, had already lived in seclusion. It was rumored that they were coldly watching from the sidelines in the Central Plains. Today, there were only a few masters in Beimang. Except for Tuoba, who was still standing, and Zhong Liang, the second head of the Zhong family, who had joined the army. Only this man surnamed Deng could support the overall situation. Therefore, he was arranged by Li Mibi, the leader of the spider web in Beimang, to be by the crown prince's side in case of an accident. After all, this young man in bright golden armor was the nominal commander-in-chief of the 400,000 troops in Beimang. The reason why Deng Mao, who was hiding in the dark, appeared was very simple. He knew that the devil in white, who had made the whole grassland bow their heads in the past, had arrived and was about to enter the battlefield. Deng Mao knew better than anyone the depth of the cultivation of the woman who had once chased through Beimang's southern court and northern court by herself. The generals of Beimang knew that they should retreat no matter what. The army behind them was about to launch a round of salvo at Beimang City to cover the rapid advance of the besieging infantry. But at this moment, the burly general, who was about to turn his horse around, felt a gust of wind blowing beside him. He turned his head in horror and found that the young man in a python robe was standing beside his horse. One of them was facing the city wall while the other was facing the city wall. The famous young man was quietly looking at the grassland army. The generals of Beimang couldn't imagine that the dignified king would personally take the risk to go out of the city. The frightened generals of Beimang were stunned and said in a trembling voice, "Why did you go out of the city? Su Fengnian, how dare you?" Without waiting for the captain to finish his words, the war horse he was riding was crushed by a mountain. Its 4 legs were broken, and its belly hit the ground with a thud. The young lord waved his hand, and the captain's body involuntarily slid towards him. Finally, the young lord grabbed the captain's head in his hand and gently threw it forward. Suddenly, the captain's body was thrown dozens of feet away, and died on the spot with blood flowing out of his 7 orifices. Chapter 1991. On the top of the city wall, a woman was beating the drum. This was probably the first time Bailiang had made such a sound to this world. Following the sound of the drum, Su Fengnian appeared outside the city. Many figures fell on the ground outside the city like meteors and stood on the same line as the young king. On the left side of the young king was a middle-aged swordsman who came from western Shu to Bailiang. He was one of the 4 grandmasters of martial arts, Dong Tai. He put his hands behind his back with 2 swords hanging from his waist. The wind blew in his face. The peach blossom sword god, who had never been recognized by anyone because of his ordinary appearance, finally showed the aura of a sword master who dominated the world of swordsmanship. On the right side of the young king was a woman in white. She was the devil Luo Yang, who had the double identity of the great idea of the tomb of Princess Beimang and the hierarch of Mount Zhulu. She didn't turn her head to look at Su Fengnian. Instead, she looked ahead and said indifferently, "You missed the appointment." The young king smiled but didn't say anything. Su Yambing landed heavily on the left side of Dong Tai with his iron spear and said softly, "I never thought that I would have the opportunity to fight side by side with the peach blossom sword god in this life." Dong Tai answered concisely, "I'm also very lucky." A woman in purple floated to the ground. She gently stomped her feet and the knot of her skirt loosened. Shenyuan Qingfeng had a relieved smile on his face, like an innocent and naive mortal woman. This was the first time this stunning woman had been so relaxed since that incident on the snowy plains. "After this battle, you and I don't owe each other anything. Then we won't meet again." Su Ying in red landed beside Luo Yang in white. She turned her head and smiled, looking at her and Shenyuan Qingfeng with a face full of joy. After the white-haired Sui Xiegu landed, he raised his only arm and twirled his snow-white eyebrows with 2 fingers. This old man who had eaten countless famous swords in the world still didn't use a sword. He just gently exhaled. A cup of wine filled the sun and moon, and a breath could destroy the 5 mountains. The blind female zither player, Xue Songguan, stood with her zither in her arms. Her head was slightly tilted as she pressed her fingers gently on the strings of the zither. Knocking one's finger to ask for longevity. Knocking one's finger to break longevity. Wu Lu Ding, the current sword crown of the Wu family's sword tomb, looked at the Beimang army in front of him and clicked his tongue. Compared to the battle formation our Wu family's old ancestor encountered back then, this is much bigger. In the future, I must brag to Wen Bushing. After this experience, I can be considered to have seen great winds and waves. Sword attendant Chui Hua, who had been keeping her eyes closed, turned her head and looked at the city wall. She glanced at the woman in white who was beating the drums like thunder. After retracting her gaze, she whispered, "Am I a little ugly and have a bad temper?" Wu Luding was stunned. He grinned and said, "Cui hua. Ever since I ate your pickled cabbage, you are the best match for me, Wu Luding." Of course. Not far away, Wudong's great spiritual master, Yu Xingrui, who was carrying a peachwood sword on his back, laughed. "Kid, you do have some of my junior brother's style." On the other side, the knife master Mao Shulang, the old Confucian scholar Cheng Baishuang, and the chief guest of Nanjiang's Dragon Palace, Ji Lu'en, stood side by side. Mao Shulang closed his eyes and rested his mind. His palm pressed against the hilt of the knife at his waist. Ji Lu'en squinted his eyes and looked towards the north. The Beimang army was surging towards them like a flood. He was calm and composed. Cheng Baishuang, who was only a step away from the realm of Confucian saint, had one hand behind his back. He raised his other hand and stroked his beard. He looked towards the sky and muttered to himself, "Mister, who said that we scholars have no guts?" On the far left, the number one person of Nanzhao, Wei Miao, crossed his arms in front of his chest. Beside him was the Dongyue sword pool's master, Chai Ching Shan. Wei Miao asked with a clumsy Central Plains accent, "Master Chai, I heard that the Dongyue sword pool scenery is very good?" Chai Ching Shan nodded and smiled. "It's not as dangerous and remote as your Shirwan Mountains, but it's also unique. If Mr. Wei has the chance to visit my Dongyue sword pool in the future, I'll definitely take out the 3 jars of apricot wine to treat you." On the far right, Yu Groom and his junior brother Lu Huang each had a knife and a sword at their waists. The sword they had was one of the world's 10 famous swords, Fu Ji, while the knife they had was just an ordinary Bailiang knife. Lu Huang said seriously, "Don't forget about the agreement." Yu Groom laughed it off. Outside the Northwest Pass, on the front line, 18 people. In the Beimang army, Chun Ju Bo, Tuoba Chiyun, and the royal relative Yelu Dongchuang looked at each other. The latter finally said, "Is this okay? Is Bailiang's final struggle?" Tuoba Chiyun turned her head and looked to the south. She didn't answer the question and said slowly, "The Crown Prince's broken spear Deng Mao, your second uncle Zhong Liang, and the Orange Province's disciplinary officer Murong Baoding. There are only 3 grandmasters of martial arts. Even if Spider Webley Mixie has a backup plan, it still seems to be a little difficult." Yelu Dongchuang's mouth twitched. "Will your father be absent from such a soul-stirring battle between grandmasters?" There was some regret in Tuoba Chiyun's eyes. She shook her head and sighed. "My father never said that he would come here in person. Maybe he really will miss it." Yelu Dongchuang curled his lips and waved his whip. He said lazily, "That would be the biggest regret in life." At this moment, in the open space between the 2 horses, a burly figure appeared out of nowhere. His arms reached to his knees, and there was a faint golden light flowing around his body. He was like a golden dragon python floating in the clouds. The newcomer said expressionlessly, "You 2 immediately retreat 10 miles. Tuoba Chiyun, the noble Beimang's disciplinary officer, turned her horse and rushed to the north without saying a word. Even the arrogant and unruly Yelu Dongchuang, after hearing this man's words, did not hesitate to retreat with Tuoba Chiyun. When this figure appeared in the Beimang army, Deng Mao, who was guarding the Crown Prince of Beimang, Devil Zhong Liang, who was on par with General Zhong Shintong, and disciplinary officer Murong Baoding, who was at the front line of the army, all 3 of Beimang's top masters were shocked. This person stood in the same place, as motionless as a mountain. Although he was on the ground, his aura was as majestic as the Kunlun of the ancestral dragon. On the North Jebei city, the sound of the drum was the loudest. A young king in a python robe with big sleeves waving in the wind said heavily, "Kill." The other 17 grandmasters of the Central Plains also said the word, "kill," at the same time. While Beimang's strong infantry in the middle moved forward steadily, a group of 5,000 elite cavalry emerged from the left and right flanks. The horses' hooves were like thunder. 2 groups of cavalry who were good at riding and archery cooperated with the infantry in the middle to shoot at the top of the North Jebei city. They were used to block the crossbows on the top of the city, and let the attacking infantry advance to the bottom of the city quickly. Lu Huang, Yu Groom, Wei Miao, and Chai Ching Shan, who were at the outermost left and right of the 18 grandmasters of the Central Plains, split into 2 groups and rushed forward calmly, blocking the charging path of the cavalry. On the path of the northern Mang army's swift and violent advance, because of the 18 people who had left the city to fend off the enemy, The ballistae that were originally behind the rain of arrows and catapults were the first to appear on the battlefield. It was as if the swords of the sword immortals of the land were unleashed with all their might, shooting towards the dozen or so masters who were blocking their path. In the vision of the sword crown of the Wu family, who was the fastest to move forward, 2 black dots instantly appeared. He laughed loudly and said, "Who can compete with the sword tomb of the Wu family when it comes to the art of controlling the sword?" While talking and laughing, the young sword crown continued to move forward. He stretched out his arms, and his 5 fingers were like hooks. The 2 ballistae that were about to pierce his shoulders at the same time were grabbed by him one after the other. The arrows that were as thick as spears had a huge inertia, and they violently rubbed against the dense chi between the young sword crown's 5 fingers, bursting out bursts of unimaginable sparks. Wu Liuding's body was dragged back more than 10 steps by the 2 arrows that were as long as a person. His feet slid on the ground, and dust flew up. Finally, he grasped the 2 arrows that were at the end of the arrow's flight. He twisted his fingers, turned his body, and shouted angrily, "I'll give them back to you!" With a speed that was not inferior to before, he threw out the 2 swords in his hands. They pierced through the air, and in one breath, they pierced through 6 or 7 shield-wielding soldiers in 2 rows. The corpses were skewered like candied haws. The young sword crown did not give up. He stood firmly with 1 foot in front and 1 behind. He put his 2 fingers together and pulled back. Sword Tomb's chi nurturing 7th force, Great Wild Goose returns. The 2 fierce arrows that were used to break through the enemy's formation were instantly pulled back, and they flew back to the young sword crown. The sword attendant beside Wu Liuding, Cui Hua, pulled out the ancient sword Su of Gojoseon and casually swung it forward, splitting a heavy arrow in half. It flew less than a foot away from her shoulders and fell to the ground 20 zhang away. The female sword attendant who stood shoulder to shoulder with the young sword crown frowned and said softly, "If you want to make a move, then make a move. When facing an enemy, making a sound is a taboo in the sword tomb. It hurts breathing the most." The young sword crown lightly shouted, "Go!" After throwing the 2 arrows forward again, he turned his head and smiled brightly at her. "I always feel that if I fight with my head down, I can't show the demeanor of a master." The sword attendant Cui Hua smiled helplessly and slowly walked forward. She raised her hand and swung her sword again, cutting a huge arrow that was flying toward the city wall from her right into half. A crossbow arrow was flying toward the great snow plateau. She tipped her toes and gracefully jumped up. When she landed, she stepped right in the middle of the arrow. The end of the arrow suddenly fell down and touched the ground. The arrowhead tilted up and continued to slide to the south until it completely stopped. Shenyuan Qingfeng stood on the arrow like this. He slightly shifted his gaze and saw the scarlet-red robe that was purposely blocking the young king's path. It was like a butterfly that was wantonly flying in the air. Wherever it passed, the powerful arrows were instantly shattered and turned into fine powder. An arrow was not able to accurately hit the sword-eater ancestor. It just brushed past his shoulder. However, the bored Sui Siegu still took the initiative to stretch out his only arm and blocked the arrow with his palm. The old man's arm did not move at all, but the arrow was broken inch by inch. Dozens of crossbow arrows that escaped the net passed through the gap between the masters and luckily shot toward the city wall. Chapter 1992. Unwittingly, the blind female zither player who was standing behind all the grandmasters suddenly stood still and placed the zither in front of her. Under the control of the chi of the woman whose mysterious finger attainments could rank in the top 3, the zither stopped in midair. The zither player listened to the sound of the wind with her eyes closed. Her thumb gently stroked the strings of the zither, and the speed at which her fingers landed on the zither became faster and faster. Every time the zither string vibrated, there would be an arrow exploding in the air around Shue Songguan for no reason. After the ballistae shot out, a wave of stifling loud noises sounded from northern Mang's middle army. A wave of pitch-black heavy rain immediately began to pour down from the great earth. Standing on top of the arrow, Hui Shanzi raised his chin slightly. His gaze followed the wave of black clouds that was getting closer and closer to the majestic rain of arrows. At this moment, Shue Songguan's unique hoarse voice sounded in everyone's ears, including Shenyuan Qingfeng. "Everyone, don't worry about what's happening above your heads." Then, an old Confucian scholar, Chang Baishuang, smiled and said, "Let this old man help Miss Shue." This old southern Tang scholar, who was appointed to become a Confucian sage at Wudong Mountain's Little Lotus Peak, closed his eyes and listened to the clear and melodious sound of the zither behind him. He murmured, "Among all the instruments, The zither has the best virtue. Therefore, since ancient times, scholars have never removed the zither for no reason. Who would have thought that I haven't played the zither for 20 years? Shwe Songguan faced the wave of arrows that covered the sky and covered the earth. She took a deep breath and pressed her hands on the zither strings for the first time. When she strummed the strings with all her might, Chang Baishuang shouted, "Great music without sound! Great music without music!" Tens of thousands of Beimang arrows stopped in the air outside the city, responding to the voice of the southern Tang scholar and the strings of the western Shu zither player. Shwe Songguan bent her little finger and hooked onto a string. She suddenly broke it. The wave of arrows that suddenly stopped in the air outside the city all shattered and fell straight down. The expressionless Shwe Songguan's mouth leaked a trace of blood. Chang Baishuang, who was extremely sensitive to people, turned his head and looked. The blind zither player, who had her eyes closed, shook her head slightly, indicating to the old Confucian that she was fine. Even though these Northern Liang and Liyang martial art masters were standing in front of the Great Army, Northern Mang's middle army still steadily advanced according to the established plan. This was especially true for the shield-wielding infantrymen at the front. It could be said that almost all of them were unafraid of death, their hearts filled with the resolve to die. Of the left and of the people. And it. Jian Guan of the Wu family's sword tomb carried a crossbow arrow on his shoulder. His hands were lazily placed on the arrow. Beside him, Jian Cuihua was holding the Su of Gojoseon. On the other side, Mao Shulang finally unsheathed his sword. The name of the sword was Dashua. Ji Lu and held his sword in front of him. His finger gently flicked the sword. The sound was clear like the cry of a young phoenix. 10 steps behind the young Luo Yang were Mount Hui Shenyuan Qingfeng, Mount Hui Sui Xiegu, and Wudong Yu Xingrui, the 3 martial masters. The 2 cavalry forces that had emerged from the flanks of the Beimang army suffered an absolutely unimaginable interception. It was absurd and tragic. Yu Groom and Lu Huang, Chai Qingshan and Wei Miao. Both of them blocked the 5,000 Beimang cavalry. The battle between the cavalry forces and the Jianghu experts had a similar effect. That is, it was all in one go. Then, what would happen if the battle between the cavalry forces and the Jianghu experts and neither side was willing to retreat? At that time, there was once the sword emperor of Shi Shu who held his sword and fought against the Su family's cavalry outside the palace gate. In the end, he was still trampled into meat paste. At that time, there were 4 people doing the same thing. Chai Qingshan and Wei Miao did not need to communicate. They chose to fight one at the front and the other at the back. If the former needed to take a breath, he would boldly retreat. The martial master behind him would take the opportunity to move forward and fill the position. One was the current sovereign of the Dongyue sword pool, the #1 person in the southeast of the Liang dynasty. The other was the leader of the Nanzhao Wulin, the #1 expert in the southwest. Chai Qingshan wore a green gown and held a 3-foot sword. His aura was like a rainbow. If he held his sword vertically, the Beimang cavalry would be split in half. If he held his sword horizontally, the men and horses would be cut in half. Wei Miao was unarmed and only had a pair of fists. He was one of the few martial masters in the world. His might was even above Lin Ya, the female martial master of Martial Emperor City. When Chai Qingshan was about to run out of breath, his body leaned back slightly. He stepped lightly and slid backward. He did not seem to be in a sorry state at all. Wei Miao, who had accumulated power and was ready to act, took a step forward, just barely brushing past the sword Dao great master who needed to take a breath of fresh air. Wei Miao's fist smashed into the head of a northern Mang warhorse, smashing that tall and large horse until it immediately knelt down. The horseman threw himself forward, hacking out with his blade while risking his life. Wei Miao raised his arms and swept outwards, the 2 corpses of the horseman and warhorse respectively flying to the sides, smashing into the northern Mang cavalry on the left and right. When a horseman from the back smashed towards Wei Miao's head, Wei Miao bent his waist and leaned to the side, smashing his shoulder into the horse's neck with a ferocious stance, sending that horseman tumbling backwards. Then, Wei Miao's hands grabbed onto the warhorse's hooves, raising it high into the air. When Wei Miao killed more than 60 elite cavalrymen, he tapped the ground with the tip of his foot and flew backwards. Immediately after, Chai Qingshan's sword rushed over, displaying the sword chi of Dongyue's high mountains and long rivers. Under Wei Miao's flawless cooperation, the 2 sword masters who had never met before did not allow the Beimang cavalry to advance even half a step. On the other side, the two proud disciples of Wang Xianji, who claimed to be the second in the world for 60 years, Wu Wu City's Yu Groom and Lu Huang, were even more radical than Chai Ching Shan and Wei Miao. If the latter could block the charge of the Beimang's 5,000 cavalrymen, then these two were simply arrogant to the point of being unreasonable. Yu Groom and Lu Huang, one on the left and one on the right, did not take out their cold sabers for the time being. They each used Shu Dao's Fu Ji, two heavy weapons, showing an irresistible force. The more they fought, the braver they became as they continued to charge forward. The sword in Lu Huang's hand was called Shu Dao. The path of the sword was unpredictable and untraceable. Every time it slashed horizontally, diagonally, and directly back, it was fierce, and incomparably domineering. Whether it was the Beimang warhorse or the armored cavalryman, under one sword, only death awaited them. Chapter 1993. On the other hand, Yu Groom, who was favored by Wang Xianji in terms of swordsmanship, was the first disciple of the martial saint who did not like to fight for fame and fortune. Therefore, he was not famous in the Central Plains Jianghu like Men Linya. However, Yu Groom's cultivation was unquestionable. No matter if it was the young king Su Fengyan or Huyen Deguan, who replaced Chao Chongqing as one of the 4 grandmasters of martial arts evaluation, they all believed that Yu Groom's true strength was the closest to Dong Tai in the world. If they were to talk about who had the most hope to stand shoulder to shoulder with the two old and new sword gods, Li Chungang and Dong Tai on the peak of swordsmanship, it would undoubtedly be Yu Groom who had the greatest hope, and not Qi Xianxia of Longhu Mountain, who also had an outstanding foundation and gave up the old swordsmanship and chose to break and rebuild. This gentle gentleman who seemed to smile at everyone and was refined and courteous. His martial arts future was vast and immeasurable. The majority of Yu Groom's sword attacks were relaxed and casual, like the common people in the marketplace who were watching a bustling scene. He had truly reached the natural realm of doing as he pleased. However, every seemingly careless pointer would cause a rider to fall off his horse and die. There was not the slightest wound caused by the long sword on the corpse. However, compared to Lu Huang's bold moves, the leisurely Yu Groom's chiseling speed was clearly a level slower. In front of him, Lu Huang turned around and casually lifted the head of a Beimang rider with his sword. He smiled at Yu Groom behind him and said, "I killed 16 more riders than you, how is it?" The calm and composed Yu Groom smiled and said, "A thin stream is long." Lu Huang snorted coldly and turned around to continue killing the enemy. After his junior apprentice brother Lu Huang turned his back to him, Yu Groom still had the mood to stand on his tiptoes and look at Wei Miao and Chai Qingshan's battlefield. Seeing the two Jianghu seniors working together, he nodded to himself. His and Lu Huang's rude and unreasonable advance was not because they were swayed by their emotions. These fellows who were born in Martial Emperor City, under the supervision of their master, almost all of them had been diligent in fighting the tide since they were young. Therefore, their one-breath qi was rather vigorous and thick, which gave them an innate advantage. Under the premise that their qi was not too different from martial artists of the same realm, he, Lu Huang, Linya, Gongbonk, and the others might have already changed their qi 3 times, but they only needed to change their qi 2 times. Bridegroom Yu lowered his head and gazed at the hilt from the Tide Listening Pavilion's armory. He couldn't help but feel a bit sad. A peerless sword had fallen on the battlefield. Wasn't it a bit unfortunate that it was born at the wrong time? Yu Groom Yu suddenly laughed out loud and sheathed his sword. At the same time, he unsheathed his cold saber. His figure suddenly rose from the ground and moved freely on the back of the Beimang cavalry. Picking up the heads of those who died with their eyes open, Yu Groom Yu, who had always been reserved, laughed boldly for the first time. "Lu Huang, how about changing your saber?" On the battlefield, taking people's heads with a cold saber is the same as breaking the tide on the city wall when we were young. It can be said to be the 2 greatest things in the world. In front, Lu Huang sneered, "Wait until my Shu Dao sword is broken." Yu Groom Yu joked, "A rough man who doesn't understand romance. No wonder he can't find a woman to warm his bed." Lu Huang didn't pay attention to this senior apprentice brother's teasing, but his sword was even fiercer and more decisive. In the center of the battlefield, for some reason, the king of feudal lords, the peach blossom sword deity, and the white-clothed Luo Yang stood still at the same time and looked to the north. The 3 of them were not only waiting for the Beimang infantry to approach, but also secretly looking for the real enemy. The young king of feudal lords finally looked at the Beimang's dazzling banner in the distance and said softly, "Then I'll go first?" The white-clothed Luo Yang didn't say yes or no. The peach blossom sword deity Dong Tai pushed his sword out of the sheath with his thumb and said flatly, "I'll help you find Tuoba Bodhisattva first." When the king of feudal lords was about to disappear in a flash, Luo Yang finally said slowly, "After Tuoba Bodhisattva makes a move, you don't have to worry about your back, just open the formation and move forward." Su Fengnian nodded and disappeared into thin air. The next moment, the young king of feudal lords appeared above the Beimang infantry formation and stepped on a big stone that had just been thrown by a giant catapult. The boulder that weighed several hundred kilograms first froze in place for an instant before smashing back to the ground at an even faster speed. Not only did it smash the catapult into pieces, but the boulder also rolled down like thunder, crushing dozens of catapults on the spot and turning them into a bloody mess. The white-clothed Luo Yang closed her eyes and sniffed gently. The battlefield of the Great Qin Empire 800 years ago was so bloody, and the battlefield 800 years later was still the same. She whispered, "The Great Qin's Luo Yang is here." Dong Tai finally found the target behind the layers of iron armor. He slightly leaned his body and then gently flicked the sword with his thumb on the hilt. The Tai sword that had never followed the Peach Blossom sword deity out of the Wu family's sword tomb was finally unsheathed today, and could show its peerless charm to its heart's content. This flying sword was too fast, the sword chi was too long, and there was too much sword will. As a result, a thin and dazzling white rainbow stretched out between the scabbard on Deng Tai's waist and the flying sword. It was as if there was a sword in the world that was 2 miles long. The young sword-crowned Wu Lu Ding, who was unwilling to fall behind, chuckled and said, "Tuhua, as a sword servant, just stand behind me and watch how I open the formation." Right when Wu Liuding's wrist shook and was about to use the crossbow bolts as great swords to open up the formation, he saw a violet-clothed figure madly collide into Northern Mang's foot formation with an invincible bearing from the corner of his eye. Countless shattered iron shields and severed limbs sprayed into the surroundings of that ball of violet light, and it was like countless scarlet-red flowers had bloomed. Wu Liuding couldn't help but mutter, "This crazy woman." Under that large banner, Northern Mang's Crown Prince His Highness passed down the order, ordering Murong Baoding and Zhong Liang to each lead 2,000 private cavalry to reinforce the 2 cavalry units that were stopped. They had to bring back the heads of those 4 Central Plains grandmasters who dared to stop a chariot with mantises. Every head was equivalent to the head of a lower third-rank general in the Northern Liang border army. Then, in front of the banner, he purposely cleared out a wide space with a radius of 1 mile. It was obvious that he was not afraid of the grandmasters from the Central Plains breaking the formation. Northern Mang's Crown Prince acted so boldly, but regardless of whether it was the experienced and prudent West River Province's disciplinary magistrate Helian Wei Wu or the shrewd Aquarius Province's disciplinary magistrate Wang Yong, none of them had the slightest objection. Even Broken Spear Deng Mao, who was in charge of the Crown Prince's safety, remained indifferent. Everyone was calmly waiting for the appearance of the young king. The calm and unruffled Crown Prince of Beimang turned his head and asked the Crown Princess, who won first place in the chess and sword music school with the surname Gu Han, with a smile, "Do you think that Su Gai dares to come?" Her face was cold. Of course. The Northern Mang Crown Prince's face was filled with disapproval. "It's good that he's here. It just so happens that this Northern Liang king understands a principle. There are millions of miraculous medicines in this world, but there is no medicine for regret." She stopped talking and sighed softly. Before marrying into the royal family, she had read all the poems and books in the Central Plains. It seemed that heroes always died at the hands of ambitious people. However, she glanced at the man beside her who finally held great power and sneered. She thought, Butcher Su Shao is an ambitious person. As the eldest son of the first wife, Su Fengnian is going to die at the hands of such an idiot. It's too pitiful. Helian Wu Wei, the Beimeng holder Wang Yong, had a complicated look in his eyes. The old man thought of the hidden plan that he had only learned about last night and sighed. It's just like this to have the whole world as your enemy. The old man who stopped his horse not far from the Crown Prince of Beimang collected his thoughts and looked at the open space in front of him. He was very emotional. He hoped that the young man would come here and fight bravely, but he also did not want him to die in grievance. But the young vassal king who had broken through 2,000 armors by himself had finally arrived.